There is a shadow under a desk in the very first episode of Futurama, a small dark shape with two round eyes, and for years, almost nobody noticed it was there. It sits under the cryogenics console on the last night of the 1900s, watching a pizza delivery boy lean back in a chair he should not have leaned back in. And it is the single most patient joke in the history of television, because the series would not explain that shadow for another 4 years. Tonight, we are climbing down the whole thing, the entire Futurama iceberg, from the parts you already love on the surface all the way down to the cold, quiet, engineered secrets at the bottom. The ciphers and the math and the deaths and the plan the writers were running the entire time. This is Futuro, so get comfortable, turn the lights down low, let your shoulders drop, and if you haven't subscribed yet, it genuinely does help us keep making these long ones. We will be here a while. Let's start at the top, at the part of the ice you can see above the water, because even the surface of this show is stranger than people give it credit for. On the face of it, Futurama is a workplace comedy. A young man named Philip J. Fry, a 25-year-old delivery boy for a place called Panucci's Pizza in 1990s New York, gets a prank order on New Year's Eve, 1999, rides his bike across the city to deliver a pizza to a cryogenics lab, discovers the order was fake, sits down in a chair to feel sorry for himself, tips backwards, and falls into an open cryogenic tube at the exact stroke of midnight. He is frozen solid, and he stays frozen for 1,000 years. When the tube's timer finally releases him, it is New Year's Eve again, the last night of the year 2999, and Fry wakes up into the 31st century, into a version of New York built on top of the ruins of the old one, a place the series calls New New York. That is the premise, and it is a good premise, but here is the thing that I think gets lost. The series could have coasted on that forever. A guy from our time loose in a cartoon future is enough of an engine to run a comedy for a decade. Most shows with that setup would have used the future as a toy box, a place to make jokes about flying cars and robots and then reset to zero at the end of every episode. Futurama does make those jokes, and it makes them beautifully, but it is doing something underneath that almost no other comedy of its era attempted, which is building a single continuous story across hundreds of episodes and multiple cancellations. A story about time and love and loss that it hides so well you can watch the funny version your whole life and never notice the sad one running right beside it. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Let's meet the crew, because they are the surface of the iceberg too, and each of them is hiding something. Fry, the man out of time, gets a job almost immediately, because in the future your career is assigned to you by a bureaucratic probing of a chip implanted in your hand, and Fry, having been a delivery boy in the past, is assigned to be a delivery boy in the future. The company he is assigned to is called Planet Express, an intergalactic shipping business run out of a converted building in New York, and it happens to be owned by his only living relative, a wildly old man named Professor Hubert J. Farnsworth, who is Fry's great-great-great and so on nephew many generations removed. The professor is somewhere around 160 years old, kept alive by future medicine and spite, a brilliant and deeply irresponsible inventor whose experiments routinely threaten the crew, the city, the planet, and on more than one occasion the entire universe. Then there is Leela, Turanga Leela, the ship's captain, a tall, competent woman with a single large eye in the center of her face. For most of the early run of Futurama, Leela believes she is an alien, the sole survivor of an alien race raised in an orphanage because her parents supposedly abandoned her. That is what she tells people. That is what she believes. And it is wrong, and the way the show reveals how wrong it is happens to be one of the cruelest, most tender reveals it ever pulled off, and we will get there far down the ice when we are ready for it. And then there is Bender Bending Rodriguez, a hard-drinking, chain-smoking, kleptomaniac robot with no discernible conscience and a catchphrase about biting his shiny metal backside, who becomes Fry's best friend within about 10 minutes of the two of them meeting inside a suicide booth. We will come back to the suicide booth, because it is one of the darkest running jokes the series ever committed to. Bender is a bending unit, a robot literally built to bend girders, and everything about his origin, his mortality, his manufacture is stranger and grimmer than his party animal exterior suggests. He is, underneath the beer and the theft, one of the load-bearing tragic figures of the whole series, though he would deny it and then steal your wallet. Rounding out the core crew, you have Amy Wong, a wealthy, clumsy engineering intern from Mars whose parents own the western hemisphere of that planet. Hermes Conrad, the company's Jamaican bureaucrat and accountant, a licensed grief counselor and former Olympic-level limbo champion who genuinely loves paperwork. And Dr. John Zoidberg, the crew's staff physician, who is a lobster-like alien from a species called the Decapodians, is completely incompetent at treating humans, and is so poor and so unloved that his poverty and loneliness become their own long-running, strangely tender joke. There is a biological fact about Zoidberg's species that reframes his entire character, and it waits for us near the bottom of the ice as well. That is the surface. A frozen man, his ancient nephew, a one-eyed captain, a criminal robot, a rich intern, a bureaucrat, and a broke lobster doctor, flying packages around a cartoon galaxy. If you have never watched it, that is the version you would be sold. And it is true. It is just nowhere near the whole truth. And the gap between the surface and the depth is the entire reason this show is worth a 2-hour descent in the dark. Here is what I find genuinely remarkable about that surface, before we go under it. Futurama was created by Matt Groening, the man who made The Simpsons, and developed by Groening together with a writer named David X. Cohen. It premiered on the Fox network on March 28, 1999. And from almost the first moment, the people making it were quietly overqualified for the job of making a cartoon about a robot who drinks. The writer's room, which we will open up properly later, was stacked with people holding advanced degrees in mathematics, physics, computer science, and chemistry. They were not slumming it. They were using a primetime animated comedy as a place to hide real theorems, real ciphers, and a long, patient, emotional argument about mortality inside a show that Fox kept trying to bury in a bad time slot. The distance between how the series was treated and what it actually was is, to me, the first real crack in the ice. And it only gets deeper from here. So let's talk about how the series was treated, because the production history of Futurama is itself one of the deeper layers of this iceberg, a survival story so improbable that the series eventually started making jokes about its own repeated near-deaths. Futurama ran on Fox from 1999 to 2003. Those are the years people mean when they say the original run, and across that stretch Fox produced 4 seasons worth of episodes. But the network never really knew what to do with it. This is the part that still frustrates longtime fans, and honestly it frustrates me a little too. Fox scheduled the show badly, moved it around, and let its Sunday night slot get eaten alive by live sports. Because when a football game runs long, the programming that follows gets pushed back or cut, and Futurama followed football. Episodes aired late, aired out of the order they were made in, or simply did not air when people expected them. For a show that was quietly building a continuous story, being aired out of order was close to a death sentence, because the jokes that pay off across episodes only work if you see the episodes in sequence. The network was treating a serialized, carefully engineered show as if it were disposable filler, something you could shuffle like a deck of cards without consequence. And then Fox simply stopped ordering more. It is worth being precise here, because the story gets told sloppily. Fox did not dramatically cancel Futurama with a press release and a funeral. It let Futurama lapse. It declined to order additional episodes after the 4th production season, and the series ran out of runway. The final Fox-era episode, an installment called The Devil's Hands Are Idle Playthings, was written to function as a series finale if it had to, and for a while it had to. It is an episode about Fry learning to play a musical instrument badly in order to express his feelings for Leela, and it ends on a note deliberately built to serve as a goodbye. That was 2003. As far as anyone knew at the time, that was the end. Except it was not. And this is where Futurama's real personality starts to show, because it refused to stay dead. It went to reruns, and in reruns, something happened that had not fully happened during the original broadcast. On Cartoon Network's late-night Adult Swim block and on DVD, people finally got to watch the episodes in order, at their own pace, in the dark, the way the series was actually built to be watched. And the audience grew. It grew large enough and loyal enough that the people who owned the property realized they had made a mistake by letting it die. So Futurama came back for the first time as 4 direct-to-DVD films, released across 2007, 2008, and 2009. This is a stretch of the show that a lot of casual fans do not even realize exists. And it is a genuinely strange and ambitious body of work, 4 feature-length stories made by a team that had been given a second life and clearly did not want to waste it. The first film, Bender's Big Score, came out in late 2007, and it is a dense, time travel-soaked story about a species of nudist alien scammers who steal the ability to travel through time using a tattoo-based code hidden on Fry's body. It is also, and we will come back to this much later, the film that quietly reaches back and rewrites the saddest thing the series had ever done, a decision fans still argue about. The second film, The Beast with a Billion Backs, arrived in the middle of 2008 and dealt with a tentacled entity from another dimension. The third, Bender's Game, came late in 2008 and was an extended parody of fantasy and Dungeons and Dragons. And the fourth, Into the Wild Green Yonder, released in early 2009, was written and structured as a genuine send-off, a real attempt to end the series on purpose this time, gracefully, on the series' own terms. Those 4 films are important for a reason beyond their content, and here is where the famously confusing bookkeeping of this show begins. Because when Comedy Central picked Futurama up to air on television, those 4 movies were recut. Each roughly 90-minute film was sliced into 4 separate half-hour episodes. So the 4 films became 16 television episodes, and those 16 episodes were packaged and broadcast as a season. If you have ever tried to figure out how many seasons of Futurama there are and found yourself getting a headache, this is the first reason why. A single story you watched as one movie also exists as 4 numbered episodes of a TV season, and both versions are, in their own accounting, canonical. Comedy Central did not stop at re-airing the films. The network commissioned genuinely new episodes, and from roughly 2010 through 2013, Futurama had a full second life on cable, producing 2 more large batches of new half-hour episodes. This is the era that gave us some of its best reviewed episodes in the entire run, including the one that won Futurama a second Emmy for Outstanding Animated Program, which we will sit with later. And then, at the end of that run, Comedy Central let it go too. Futurama was canceled a second time, and it produced a second finale, an episode called Meanwhile, which aired on September 4th, 2013. Meanwhile is, in my opinion, the loveliest ending the show ever wrote, and because I want to give it the space it deserves, I am going to hold it until we are much further down, in the dark where it belongs. For now, just hold the fact. 2013, a second ending. Another goodbye that everyone assumed was final. It was not final either, because 10 years later, in 2023, Futurama came back a third time, now on Hulu, with a new order of episodes, and it has kept going, releasing further batches across 2024 and 2025, including a run of episodes that dropped all at once in September of 2025, rather than week by week. There are reports of still more on the way. Think about the shape of that. A show that premiered in 1999, was allowed to die around 2003, came back as films, came back on cable, was canceled again in 2013, and then came back once more a full decade after that. Futurama has now outlived its own cancellation 3 separate times. It has written itself at least 3, arguably 4, different series finales, each one crafted so it could work as a real ending, because each time the people making it did not know if they would be allowed to make more. I want to be careful with the numbers here, because this is one of the places where a lazy script gets things wrong, and the truth is more interesting than a clean number anyway. If you count total episodes, the figure lands around 170 as of the 2025 batch. But the season count depends entirely on which system you use, and there are two competing systems that do not agree. There is a production season count, the way the discs and the official production records label things, which runs to roughly 10 seasons across all these eras. And there is a broadcast and streaming count, the way networks marketed the series as it aired, which is why Hulu labels its revival episodes as seasons 11, 12, and 13, even though they are only the 8th, 9th, and 10th seasons it ever produced. The jump from a 7th season to an 11th season looks like a mistake, but it is not. It exists because the original Fox episodes were broadcast across 5 seasons, and the two big Comedy Central orders were each split in half for streaming purposes, inflating the broadcast count, and Hulu simply picked up the broadcast numbering where it left off. So both this is the 10th season and this is season 13 can be true at the same time, describing the same episodes, depending on which ledger you are reading from. If you ever want to feel the over-engineered soul of this franchise in a single fact, it is that Futurama cannot even agree with itself about how many seasons of Futurama exist. And the series knows. That is the part I love. This is a series that became fully, openly aware of its own doomed and resurrected status and started folding it into the jokes. The revival films and later episodes are full of winking references to executives, to cancellation, to characters being frozen and thawed and frozen again, and the whole recurring imagery of Fry being trapped in a tube, put on ice, and revived when someone finally wants him again, starts to feel less like a premise and more like the series describing its own relationship with the networks that kept killing it. When your central character is a man who gets frozen, forgotten for 1,000 years, and then brought back to life because he turns out to matter more than anyone realized, and your show keeps getting frozen, forgotten, and brought back to life because it turns out to matter more than anyone realized, at some point the metaphor stops being an accident. Futurama is a show about surviving your own death, made by a show that kept surviving its own death, and I do not think you can fully separate the two. Now let's go a little deeper, into the room where all of this was built, because the writer's room of Futurama is one of the strangest creative teams ever assembled for a comedy, and once you know what was in it, a lot of the show's stranger habits start to make sense. The headline fact, the one that gets repeated because it is true and because it is hard to believe, is that the Futurama writing staff was absurdly overeducated for the job of making a cartoon. Collectively, the room held multiple doctorates and a stack of master's degrees in real, difficult subjects. We are talking about advanced degrees in applied mathematics, in physics, in computer science, in chemistry, from institutions like Harvard, Stanford, Berkeley, and Princeton. These were not people who had watched a lot of science fiction and knew the vocabulary. These were people who had done original research, taught at universities, published, and then decided that what they really wanted to do with those minds was write jokes about a robot who steals. Let me name a few of them, because the specific Ursums are the good part. David X. Cohen, the co-developer and for years Futurama runner, has a bachelor's degree in physics from Harvard and a master's in computer science from Berkeley. Ken Keeler, one of Futurama's most important writers, holds a doctorate in applied mathematics from Harvard and a master's in electrical engineering from Stanford. And he is the man who, as we will see when we get down to the math layer, invented an entirely new mathematical theorem specifically for one episode. Jeff Westbrook left a career as a computer science researcher, including work as a professor at Yale, to come write for the series, carrying a doctorate from Princeton. Bill Odenkirk, the brother of the actor Bob Odenkirk, holds a doctorate in inorganic chemistry. That is the caliber of person who was sitting around breaking stories about Bender getting drunk and Zoidberg being poor. And what moves me about that, more than the sheer intelligence of it, is this. They did not use those degrees to show off, at least not in the way you would expect. They used them to hide things. The math and the science in Futurama are almost never explained to you. They are buried in the background, in a sign you cannot read, in a serial number you would never think to factor, in a line of dialogue that is technically a real proof. The writers built an entire second show underneath the first one, a show made of puzzles, and then they never told you it was there. They just left it. trusting that some tired viewer decades later would freeze the frame and start to notice. That is an extraordinary amount of faith to put in an audience. And almost nobody in television has ever had that kind of faith. We are going to reward it later when we reach the Ciphers and the Theorem, but I wanted to plant it here, at the level of the people, so you understand that the depth of this iceberg is not an accident of fan interpretation. It was engineered by people who could have been doing something else with those brains and chose this. There is a smaller human detail about the series co-creator that I love, and it belongs right here. David X. Cohen was not born with that middle initial. He was born David Samuel Cohen. The problem was that when the writers on Fox's animated shows unionized in the late 1990s, the Writers Guild already had a David S. Cohen on its rolls, and you cannot have two members credited under the same name. So he needed a new one. And rather than pick another ordinary initial, he chose the letter X because, by his own account, it sounded more science fiction, which is a wonderful reason. He added a period after it so that people would not read his name as David multiplied by Cohen, a joke that only a room full of mathematicians would even think to worry about. So the X in David X. Cohen stands for nothing. It is a piece of deliberate, affectionate nonsense, a made-up initial chosen for vibe, and it has been on the credits of one of the smartest shows on television for over 25 years. I think that tells you almost everything about the sensibility of the place. The cast is its own small marvel, and it is worth pausing on because one of the quiet feats of Futurama is how few people it takes to make all that noise. The core voice cast is tiny relative to the enormous population of characters. Billy West alone voices an astonishing share of the show. He is Fry, he is also Professor Farnsworth, he is also Dr. Zoidberg, he is also Zap Brannigan, the pompous, catastrophically incompetent starship captain. He is also, among many others, the disembodied living head of Richard Nixon, who, as we will get to, runs the planet. One actor, carrying a lead role and a fistful of Futurama's most beloved supporting characters at the same time, often in the same scene, talking to himself. Katie Sagal, a serious and accomplished actress, gives Leela a groundedness that anchors the whole ensemble. John DiMaggio is Bender, and it is hard to imagine anyone else in that armor. And a small handful of others, Maurice LaMarche, Phil Lamar, Lauren Tom, Tress MacNeille, David Herman, Frank Welker, cover a sprawling galaxy of aliens, robots, mutants, and monsters between them. The economy of it is part of the craft. When you hear 100 different characters and it is really only 7 or 8 people doing all the voices, the world feels bigger than the budget, and that illusion is doing a lot of quiet work. I said John DiMaggio is Bender, and it is hard to imagine anyone else, and that turns out to be more than a compliment because it nearly became the plot of a real-world crisis. When Hulu announced the revival in early 2022, one voice was conspicuously missing from the returning cast. John DiMaggio had not signed on, over what was reported as a dispute about pay and contract terms. And the fans lost it. A campaign sprang up under the banner Bendergate, with the hashtag spreading fast. Fans openly protesting the idea that Bender might be recast, that anyone else might be allowed to say the shiny metal line. It became a genuine public standoff. And it resolved the way these things only sometimes do, with DiMaggio returning to voice Bender after all. He later spoke about it fairly frankly, saying that in the end he did not actually get the pay increase he had been asking for, that what he got was more along the lines of respect, of being heard. Notably, no other original main cast member was recast for the revival, so the crew you hear on Hulu is essentially the crew you have always heard. I find the whole episode telling because it is a rare case where the audience's attachment to a specific human voice became powerful enough to change a corporate decision. People were not just fond of Bender, they were fond of that Bender, that exact throat, and they would not accept a copy. For a show obsessed with duplicates and replacements and the question of whether a copy of a person is really that person, it was an oddly on-theme controversy to have. Before we leave the level of production and go under the water into the world itself, there is one more surface detail I want to give you, because it is the kind of thing you can start noticing tonight, and it rewards you every single episode. Every episode of Futurama opens with the logo, and underneath the logo, on the title card, there is a one-line caption. A different one every time. Sometimes it is a fake disclaimer. Sometimes it is a jab at the network. Sometimes it is a joke aimed squarely at the kind of person who reads title cards. This is the series version of the running gags that open The Simpsons, its own small ritual of a joke you have to be paying attention to catch. And in the early seasons, the opening also flashed a snippet of a genuine vintage cartoon on a screen behind the ship. A little scrap of animation history playing for a fraction of a second. These are tiny things. But they are the first sign, right there in the opening seconds, that this is a show that hides jokes in places most shows treat as dead space, that assumes you might pause, that rewards the freeze frame. Once you know the captions are there, you cannot stop reading them, and that habit, that little instinct to look closer at the parts of the frame you are supposed to ignore, is exactly the instinct you need for everything waiting further down. So let's go under the water now, into the furniture of the future itself, the strange machinery of the world it built, because a lot of the deepest Futurama lore is not a hidden twist at all. It is a piece of set dressing so casually presented that you accept it in half a second and only later realize how dark it actually is. Start with the best known piece of that furniture, which is a man's head in a jar running the planet. In the 31st century, the president of Earth is Richard Nixon. Not a robot modeled on Nixon, not an actor playing Nixon. The actual, historical, disembodied living head of Richard Milhouse Nixon, preserved in a jar of liquid, mounted on a giant robot body, elected to lead the entire planet. He first takes power early in Futurama's run, in an episode about a planetary election, and he simply never leaves, ruling Earth from roughly the year 3000 onward. The joke underneath the joke is beautiful. In our world, an American president cannot serve more than 2 terms. Nixon gets around this because he is technically no longer the man, he is a head. The 2-term limit applied to a body that is long dead. The head is a new legal entity, or so he argues, and it lets him rule more or less forever. It is a satire that works on about 4 levels at once, and it is delivered as if it were nothing, just the way things are now. And Nixon is not a one-off. He is the flagship example of one of the show's cleverest world-building devices, the Head Museum, where the preserved living heads of real historical and celebrity figures are kept in jars of liquid, awake, talking, immortal. This is how the series gets to feature real famous people as characters 1,000 years after they died. The heads are a running joke and a practical solution at the same time, because it means the series can bring in a guest voice or a caricature of a real person and place them directly into the future without any time travel required. They are just there, in their jars, having been preserved at some point and now living on indefinitely as talking heads on shelves. It is an eerie idea when you stop to think about it, an eternity spent as a head on a shelf, but Futurama plays it so lightly that the horror only creeps up on you afterward. That is a pattern you are going to see again and again as we descend. The darkest ideas in Futurama are almost never presented as dark. They are presented as ordinary. Nothing demonstrates that better than the suicide booths, and I want to spend a moment here because this is one of the pitch-black jokes the series committed to from literally its first episode and never softened. On the street corners of New York, alongside the newspaper stands and the mailboxes, there are coin-operated public suicide machines. You put in a coin, you step inside, and the booth kills you, offering a menu of methods. In that opening episode, Fry and Bender, newly met, both miserable, walk into one of these booths together, each intending to end things, and it becomes the scene where they bond, because Fry mistakes it for a telephone booth. The machine's voice cheerfully announces that you have selected one of its options. It is one of the darkest gags a comedy has ever opened on, and the show never treats it as shocking. The booths are just part of the streetscape, as normal as a vending machine, and the casualness is the entire joke. The idea reportedly has roots in a very old animated short from the 1930s, a Donald Duck cartoon full of absurd automated machines. And Futurama took that vein of dark mechanical whimsy and pushed it about as far as it will go. What gets me about the suicide booths is not that they exist in the world, it is that nobody in the world finds them remarkable. The future it is describing is one where despair has been so thoroughly industrialized and normalized that you can end your life for the price of a snack, on a street corner, between errands, and the series trusts you to feel the chill of that on your own without ever underlining it. Let me give you the physics of this world too, because the way Futurama handles science is a whole layer of its personality, and the flagship example is how the ship moves. The Planet Express ship, the green delivery vessel the crew flies across the galaxy, does not travel through space the way you would assume. The series establishes, quite deliberately, that the ship's dark matter engines do not move the ship at all. They move the universe around it. The ship stays still, in a sense, and the cosmos is shifted past it. This sounds like a throwaway line, and it is delivered like one, but it is actually the writers dodging a real problem in physics. There is a hard cosmic speed limit, the speed of light, and you cannot simply have your delivery van outrun it without breaking the rules of reality the series otherwise likes to respect. So the writers came up with two jokes that are also, in their way, solutions first. They established that the ship moves the universe rather than itself, which sidesteps the speed limit on a technicality. And second, they established as an offhand historical footnote that back in the year 2208, scientists simply increased the speed of light to make faster travel possible. Think about the audacity of that gag. Rather than invent a magic drive, they treated the speed of light as a piece of infrastructure that a future government could vote to upgrade, like raising a speed limit on a highway. It is a joke that only lands fully if you actually understand why the speed of light is a problem in the first place. Which means it is once again a joke the writers built for the people in the audience who did the reading and left as harmless background noise for everyone else. And the fuel for those engines is one of the more elegantly disgusting pieces of world building in the show. The dark matter that powers the ship is produced by Nibbler's species, and it is, to put it plainly, their excrement. That small, cute, big-eyed creature we glimpsed in the shadow under the desk in the very first scene of the whole series turns out to belong to a race whose waste is a fuel more valuable than anything else in the universe. I am flagging that here, but holding the full weight of it, because Nibbler is one of the great long games of the entire show. And where that shadow leads is a story I want to tell properly when we are deeper down. For now, just file it away, because we have now touched that shadow twice, once at the very top of the ice and once here, and both times I have refused to tell you what it means. That refusal is on purpose. Futurama made you wait years. The least I can do is make you wait an hour. The texture of this world is relentlessly, almost aggressively inventive in this way, and I think it is worth naming what the writers are actually doing, because it is not random. Futurama's future is not utopian, and it is not a straightforward dystopia either. It is something more honest and more unsettling, which is a future that is exactly as broken, petty, bureaucratic, and sad as the present, just with better toys. The robots are alcoholics. The president is a preserved criminal. You can kill yourself in a booth on the corner. The costliest substance in the universe is animal waste. The speed of light got raised by legislation. Every piece of this is a joke, and every piece of it is also a small, precise argument that the future will not save us from ourselves, that we will drag all our worst habits 1,000 years forward and simply automate them. There is a real melancholy running under the gleaming surface of this world, and Futurama almost never says it out loud. It just builds the melancholy into the machinery and lets you find it. That, to me, is the thing the surface fans of Futurama sometimes miss. The jokes are not decoration on top of a fun future. The jokes are how the series smuggles in a bleak, tender view of what people are like, and the fact that it is all so funny is exactly what lets it get away with being so sad. Let's stay at this level for a while, in the recurring furniture of it, because Futurama built a whole gallery of running gags and returning characters that function almost like folklore. Little legends the show tells about itself over and over, and each one has a strangeness worth pulling apart. Consider Robot Santa. In this future, Christmas, or Xmas as the series spells it, is not a season of warmth. It is a season of terror, because humanity built a robotic Santa Claus, an 8-foot-tall machine programmed to judge whether people have been naughty or nice and to reward or punish them accordingly. The problem is a manufacturing defect. His standards were set impossibly, catastrophically high, so high that he judges essentially every living being to be naughty, without exception. The result is that once a year, on Xmas, Robot Santa descends on New York and tries to murder the entire population as punishment for a niceness they could never possibly achieve. He is introduced early in a second season Xmas episode, and he keeps coming back, a heavily armed sleigh-riding engine of judgment against whom the only rational response is to bar the doors and hide. What I love about Robot Santa as a piece of design is that he is, underneath the machine guns, a sharp joke about perfectionism and about the impossibility of the standards we set for goodness. Here is a being whose entire function is to evaluate whether you are good enough, calibrated so tightly that nobody ever is, so that the machine built to reward virtue becomes a machine that punishes everyone equally. There is something almost theological in it, a merciless god of the holidays who finds all of humanity wanting, and the series plays it as pure slapstick horror. Then there is Slurm, the best-selling soft drink in the universe, a bright green, wildly addictive soda that the crew and everyone else drinks constantly. In the first season finale, Futurama does a full parody of the classic story of the chocolate factory, sending the crew to tour the secret Slurm bottling plant to discover how the beloved beverage is made. And what they find is one of the series' great grotesque punchlines. The secret ingredient, the thing that makes Slurm so irresistible, is a fluid secreted from the rear of an enormous creature called the Slurm Queen deep in the factory. The galaxy's favorite drink is, in plain terms, a bodily secretion from the back end of a giant worm. And the part that I think is actually the sharp bit, the part that lifts it from a gross-out gag to something with teeth, is this. The crew learns the horrifying truth, and they keep drinking it anyway. They cannot stop. The addiction is stronger than the disgust. There is even a mascot in that story, a party-loving worm who sacrifices himself to help the crew escape. A send-up of a certain beer mascot of the era, and the crew's response to everything they have witnessed is simply to crack open another can. It is a joke about consumption and denial that is honestly a little too accurate. The way we would rather not know how the thing we love is made, and how knowing changes nothing about whether we keep consuming it. If you have spent any time on the internet at all, you have met the next one, even if you did not know where it came from. The Hypnotoad. A large, warty amphibian with enormous eyes that pulse and buzz with hypnotic patterns, capable of instantly bending the will of anyone who looks at it. It debuts in a third season episode and then simply refuses to leave the show's mythology, becoming one of Futurama's most enduring background legends. The phrase associated with it, "all glory to the Hypnotoad," became a genuine catchphrase, and the series leaned all the way into the joke by establishing that in this universe there is an entire hit television program called Everybody Loves Hypnotoad, which consists of nothing but the Hypnotoad staring into the camera and hypnotizing its audience. The gag is a quiet piece of media satire, a show about a nation of people sitting slack-jawed in front of a screen that is quite literally hypnotizing them into loving it, which is a joke that has aged in a direction the writers probably found funny and a little frightening. But mostly the Hypnotoad works because it is committed to. The series never over-explains it. It just keeps appearing, buzzing, and the audience, both the fictional one and the real one, keeps chanting its praises. Futurama even built its own afterlife, its own theology, and this is one of the parts of the world I find most inventive. Robots in Futurama have their own religion called robotology, complete with sin, damnation, and a place they go when they are bad, which is Robot Hell, located in one of Futurama's better geography jokes in New Jersey. Robot Hell is presided over by the Robot Devil, a red mechanical demon who operates on a principle the show takes surprisingly seriously, which is that deals are binding. A contract with the Robot Devil is real, enforceable, and cannot simply be wished away. And this becomes the engine of one of the series' most emotionally significant episodes, the one Fox went out on, where Fry ends up in possession of the Robot Devil's own hands after a series of trades. When he tries to give them back, he is reminded that a deal is a deal, that the exchange was made freely and cannot be undone just because he regrets it. There is a whole worked-out logic to Futurama's supernatural side, robot gods and human afterlives and binding infernal contracts, and it is played for laughs, but it is never lazy. The rules are consistent, and it honors them even when honoring them hurts the characters. And I have to give you Zap Brannigan, because he is one of the great comic creations of the whole run, and because he embodies a very specific and very funny kind of awfulness. Zap is a decorated captain in the Earth military, a strutting, self-satisfied, catastrophically stupid and vain man who is treated by the institutions around him as a hero while being, in reality, a coward, a fool, and a menace to everyone under his command. His most famous victory involved sending wave after wave of his own robot soldiers to their destruction until the enemy's ability to kill them was exhausted, which he recounts as brilliant strategy rather than as the atrocity it obviously is. He is perpetually, disastrously convinced of his own irresistibility, especially where Leela is concerned, and his long-suffering alien lieutenant, Kif, responds to him with some of the finest sighs ever animated. Zap is a satire of a very recognizable type: the empty uniform, the confidence with nothing under it, the man who has failed upward so completely that he no longer knows the difference between competence and reputation. And he is voiced, like so much of the series, by Billy West, doing an impression rooted in a particular bombastic mid-century broadcasting voice, which makes the pomposity land even harder. Underneath all of these is the layer of catchphrases, the little verbal signatures the show hands its characters, and they are worth a moment because they became the series' most portable pieces, the parts that escaped into the wider culture. Professor Farnsworth announces developments to the crew with a cheerful cry of good news, everyone, which is almost always the prelude to something horrifying or lethal, a bit of dramatic irony so reliable that the phrase itself became a meme wildly detached from the series, used all over the internet to introduce bad news. Bender has his shiny metal line, the boast about biting a part of his anatomy, delivered with total confidence in an enormous range of situations. Farnsworth also has his cries of dismay, his sweet zombie invocations when things go wrong. And there is a phrase, "Shut up and take my money," spoken by Fry in a later episode about being so eager to buy a product that he no longer cares about the details, that became one of the best-known reaction images on the entire internet. A shorthand for consumer desire completely divorced from its origin. I want to be honest about that one, because it is a place where the myth outruns Futurama. That line is far more famous as an internet meme than it ever was as a repeated catchphrase inside the series. It essentially appears, becomes immortal online, and lives a life out there far larger than its role in the actual episode, which is its own little lesson about how this show works. Futurama is a series whose fragments travel. A shadow, a serial number, a title card, a single line about money, all of them break off and drift into the wider world and get loved by people who could not tell you which episode they came from. The series is built out of pieces that are strong enough to survive on their own, And I think that is part of why it keeps refusing to die. You cannot fully kill something whose best parts have already scattered into everyone else's memory. Now we go down to a colder, quieter part of the ice, and I want to slow the whole thing down for this stretch, because we are leaving the layer of jokes and entering the layer that Futurama is secretly most famous for, which is its ability to break your heart. This is the part of the show that people who only remember the funny version are always a little stunned to rediscover. And it is the part that, for me, moves Futurama from a great comedy into something more than that. Let's start with the one that has a reputation, the one people warn each other about, the one that generated actual angry letters to the writers when it aired. It is a 4th season episode about Fry's dog. Long before he was frozen, back in the 1990s, Fry had a dog, a scruffy mutt named Seymour that he found outside the pizzeria where he worked. In the future, 1,000 years later, the crew discovers Seymour's fossilized remains, perfectly preserved. And the professor tells Fry that, with future technology, they can extract enough genetic material from the fossil to clone the dog, to bring Seymour back, to give Fry his companion again. Fry is overjoyed. But then he starts to think about it. He reasons that Seymour was already about 3 years old when Fry was frozen, and the fossil shows a dog who lived to a full old age, which means Seymour lived 12 more years after Fry vanished. And Fry, wanting to believe something comforting, decides that those 12 years must have been good ones, that the dog surely moved on, found another owner, had a full and happy life, and that there is no point bringing back a copy of a dog who already lived out his whole story. Though he chooses not to clone him, he lets Seymour rest. And then the series does the thing. It does not stay with Fry's comforting version. It shows you what those 12 years actually were. In the final sequence, with almost no dialogue, we see Seymour as a puppy being told by Fry to wait, to stay outside the pizzeria until Fry comes back. And then we watch the dog do exactly that. We watch him sit in the same spot outside Panucci's Pizza through the seasons, through rain, through snow, through years, aging, growing gray and thin, watching other people come and go, waiting for a boy who was, unknown to the dog, frozen in a tube across the city and never coming. The dog waits his entire remaining life. He does not move on. He does not find a new owner. He obeys the last thing Fry ever told him, which was to wait, and he waits until he is old and can barely stand. And then he lies down in that same spot and dies, still waiting. The scene is scored with an old love ballad about waiting, and it plays it completely straight, no jokes, no undercut, just a dog dying alone of loyalty. The episode first aired in November of 2002, and it is regularly named among the saddest half hours of television ever made, animated or otherwise. The writers reportedly received hate mail, not because it was bad, because it was too effective, because people felt ambushed, because they had tuned in for a cartoon about a robot and instead got the single most devastating meditation on loyalty and abandonment that the medium had produced in years. Here is the part that I think makes it more than just a sad scene, the reason it works so precisely. The tragedy is doubled by irony. Fry chose not to clone the dog because he told himself a story where the dog was fine. He protected himself from grief by imagining a happy ending. And it, gently and mercilessly, shows the audience the real ending that Fry will never see. The ending that makes his decision heartbreaking rather than wise. Fry thinks he is honoring a dog who lived a full life. We know he is abandoning, a second time, a dog who spent his whole life waiting to be unabandoned. The gap between what Fry believes and what actually happened is the exact same engine that powered the sad version of the waiting dog, and it is the exact same engine, if you think about it, that powers the whole premise of the series. A man frozen away from everyone who loved him, everyone left behind to live out their years without him, never knowing what happened. Seymour is Futurama in miniature. Seymour is what the series is actually about. underneath the spaceships. It is about the people and the animals and the time you cannot get back, and the ones who wait. I told you earlier that this show has a habit of reaching back and rewriting its own saddest moments. And this is the clearest case of it, so let me close the loop, because it is one of the more debated decisions in the whole franchise. Years later, in the first of the direct-to-DVD films, the one about the time travel scammers, the show quietly retcons Seymour's fate. Through the film's time travel mechanics, it is established that a duplicate of Fry actually escaped back into the past and lived out the years from 2000 onward, and that this Fry was with Seymour for those years, that the dog was not, in fact, alone the whole time, that he had his boy after all before the fossilization happened. It is a softening. It takes the unbearable ending and makes it bearable. And fans are split on whether that was a kindness or a mistake. Some are grateful, relieved to be told the dog was not really abandoned. Others feel that the original scene was a perfect, complete thing, and that reaching back to comfort the audience robbed it of exactly the pitiless honesty that made it great. I go back and forth on it myself. Part of me thinks the bravest thing Futurama ever did was let that dog die alone, and that walking it back was a flinch. And part of me understands wanting to give the animal his happiness back, even retroactively, even at the cost of the perfect wound. That the series cared enough to return to it at all, years later, tells you how much that scene weighed on the people who made it. You do not go back and rescue a fictional dog unless he haunted you too. There is a companion piece to that episode from the season before that works the same devastating trick in a different key, and it is the one I would point to if someone told me they only wanted to understand how Futurama builds an emotional trap. It is a third season episode about Fry's older brother, Yancey. Throughout Fry's flashbacks to his old life, we see Yancey as a bully, a brother who copied Fry, who took his things, who Fry believed stole his identity and his dreams. Fry had a prized possession as a kid, a rare 7-leaf clover, a lucky charm he treasured. And the episode cuts between the present, where Fry in the future discovers that his clover and other keepsakes were stolen from where he left them, and the past, building Fry's case that his brother Yancey was the thief, the one who always took what was his. Fry tracks down what happened to his belongings across 1,000 years, following the trail of a man who used that 7-leaf clover to become famous and successful, a man Fry is sure is his thieving brother having stolen his luck along with everything else. And then the twist lands, and it recontextualizes everything the same way the Seymour montage did, by revealing that the story Fry told himself was the opposite of the truth. The famous man was not Yancey. It was Yancey's son. Because after Fry disappeared, presumed dead, his brother Yancey, the brother he resented, the brother he thought had spent his life stealing Fry's identity, named his own newborn son Philip J. Fry after the little brother he had lost. Yancey was not copying Fry out of spite. He looked up to him, and when Fry vanished, Yancey kept him alive the only way he could, by giving his lost brother's name to his own child, so that there would go on being a Philip J. Fry in the world. The clover, the keepsake Fry was so sure had been stolen from him, is found at the end resting on a grave. The grave of that nephew, the second Philip J. Fry, who had carried the name and the luck through his whole life. Fry, in the present, realizes at last that his brother never hated him, that he was loved and missed and honored by the very person he spent his childhood resenting, and that he is standing at the grave of a man who lived a whole life carrying his name. It is the same structure as the dog, a character armored in a comforting or self-justifying story, and then it, quietly, showing the truth underneath, which is almost always more tender and more painful than the lie. I think these two episodes, back-to-back across 2 seasons, are where Futurama quietly announced that it was not really a comedy at all. It was a show about grief that happened to be extremely funny, which is a much rarer and more valuable thing. Let's stay in the deep emotional water, because there are a few more of these, and each one goes after a different feeling. If the dog and the brother are about loss and about the stories we tell to survive it, The next one is about something even bigger, about scale, about God, about whether anyone is watching at all. There is an episode where Bender, of all characters, gets launched into deep space by accident and drifts alone through the void. And while he is out there, a tiny civilization of microscopic beings takes root on his metal body and begins to evolve. To them, Bender is not a robot. He is the world, the surface of their entire existence, and eventually, inevitably, they come to worship him as their god. Bender, who has spent the entire series as a gleefully selfish, godless, morally bankrupt character on the series, suddenly finds himself in the position of an actual deity, with worshippers who pray to him, who ask him for guidance, who suffer and die based on whether or not he chooses to intervene. And he is terrible at it, of course. He tries to help them and causes disasters. He tries to answer their prayers and starts wars. Everything a god might do to make things better for the people who love him goes wrong, because intervention on that scale cannot be aimed precisely enough to do only good. And then, drifting further, Bender encounters something else. A vast entity made of stars. A galaxy-shaped intelligence that may or may not be the actual god of this universe. And the two of them have a conversation. Bender, wrestling with his failure as a god to his tiny worshippers, asks this cosmic being how you are supposed to do it, how you help people without ruining their lives, how much a god should intervene. And the entity gives him an answer that has become, quite rightly, one of the most quoted lines the show ever wrote. It tells Bender that when you do things right, people won't be sure you've done anything at all. That is the whole philosophy of a light touch, compressed into a single sentence. The idea that real help, real grace, is invisible. That the better you do the job, the less anyone will ever know you were involved. That a truly good God leaves no fingerprints and gets no credit. It is a profound piece of theology to find in a cartoon, and the writers have said it grew directly out of the question of what a god should actually do. I find it one of the loveliest things it ever said, and it lands harder because it comes out of the mouth of a being of stars talking to a chain-smoking robot who just accidentally wiped out a civilization. Futurama earns the profundity by refusing to be solemn about it. Then there is the one that won the series its second Emmy for Outstanding Animated Program, and it is my personal favorite of all of them, an episode built around the cruelest and most beautiful idea in the series' whole relationship with time. The professor in his tinkering builds a time machine, but it comes with a catastrophic limitation. It can only travel forward. There is no reverse. Once you go into the future, you cannot come back. You can only go further forward, deeper into the future. Forever Fry, Bender, and the professor climb in, meaning only to skip ahead a little, and through a mishap they overshoot, and then they realize they cannot go back. And their only hope of ever returning to their own time is a desperate, absurd, magnificent bet that if they keep going forward long enough, all the way to the end of the universe might end and begin again, might loop around and deliver them back to a recreation of the moment they left. So they ride. They travel forward through the death of everything they knew. They watch civilizations rise and fall in fast forward. They watch the earth change, watch humanity's descendants come and go, watch the whole story of intelligent life play out and end more than once. They pass the point where anyone they loved has been dead for millions of years and keep going. And the emotional core of it is the way the three of them just keep each other company on a one-way trip past the end of the world, cracking jokes, because there is nothing else to do and no way back. The episode does eventually loop the universe around, in an audacious sequence involving the cosmos recreating itself so precisely that history repeats, and it finds a way to bring them home. But the feeling that lingers is not relief. It is the vertigo of having watched a comedy calmly stare down the literal end of everything and find in that not despair, but a kind of companionship. Three friends at the end of time deciding to keep going forward together because forward is the only direction left. It is Futurama's whole philosophy of mortality in one episode. You cannot go back. You can only go on, and who you go on with is the entire point. I have been holding Leela's secret since the very top of the ice, and this is the right place to finally set it down, because it belongs with these, and because it is the reveal that reframes her entire character. For years, Leela believes she is an alien, the lone survivor of a vanished species, raised in an orphanage, unwanted, abandoned by parents she assumes did not care enough to keep her. Her single eye marks her as different from every human around her, and she has built her whole identity around being alone in the universe, the last of her kind, tough because she had to be, because no one was ever coming for her. And then, in a fourth season episode about her origins, the truth comes out, and it is the same shape as all the others. The comforting or painful story she told herself was wrong, and the truth underneath is more painful and more tender at once. Leela is not an alien. She is a mutant. Her single eye is a mutation, and mutants in this world live hidden away in the sewers beneath New York, legally barred from the surface, treated as second class, kept out of sight. And her parents did not abandon her. They loved her. They gave her up specifically because they were mutants, and she, they hoped, could pass as an alien rather than a mutant, and an alien could live on the surface, could have a life, could have opportunities that a known mutant child never would. So they left her at an orphanage with a note in a language she could not read, and then they watched over her whole life, from the shadows, from the sewers, following her, protecting her, present at the edges of her story the entire time she believed herself to be utterly alone. Every time Leela thought no one cared, her parents were there, just out of sight, unable to reveal themselves without destroying the better life they had sacrificed everything to give her. It is once again the exact engine. The character who armored herself in a story, in this case the story that she was alone and unwanted, and Futurama pulling the armor away to reveal that she was loved the entire time and simply could not see it. And it does something specific and important to Leela as a character, because it means her toughness, her competence, her guardedness. All the things she built to survive being alone were built on a loneliness that was never fully real. Her parents' love was always there, running silently underneath her life like the sewers run under the city. I think Leela's homeworld is one of the underrated of the show's emotional episodes, precisely because it is quieter than the dog, less of an ambush, but it does the same work, and it does it for the character who most needed it. Leela spends the series being the responsible one, the adult, the one holding the crew together, and this is the episode that tells you why she is like that, and, gently, that she did not have to be as alone as she made herself. And that brings us finally to the ending I have been protecting all this time. The second series finale, the one that aired in 2013 when everyone thought the series was truly gone for good. I held it because I think it is the most beautiful thing it ever did, and because it deserved to arrive at the bottom of the emotional descent rather than the middle. In this episode, through a device that lets time be stopped for everyone except the person holding a certain button, Fry and Leela end up alone together in a world frozen in a single instant. Everyone and everything around them paused, motionless, mid-motion. And rather than panic, they decide to live in it. They spend what amounts to an entire lifetime together in that frozen world, walking through a city held in perfect stillness, growing old side by side while the rest of existence waits, paused, around them. Decades pass for the two of them. They build a whole life inside a single stopped second. And at the very end, when a way is found to reset time back to the moment before it all froze, they are given the choice to undo it, to go back to being young, to erase the lifetime they spent together and start over as they were. The professor asks them, essentially, do you want to go around again? And they look at each other. Two old people who have just lived an entire quiet life together in a frozen world, and they say yes. They choose to do all of it again. That is where the series left us in 2013, And if it had stayed the ending forever, it would have been perfect. Two people who spent the whole series almost together, finally given a lifetime alone with each other, choosing, without hesitation, to live that lifetime once more. After everything, after all the time this show spent on loss and waiting and the things you cannot get back, it ended on the one thing it had been reaching toward the whole time, which is two people deciding that a life together, even a strange and stolen one, even one they will lose, was worth having. And worth having again. Now we come to it. We are deep enough now, and I have made you wait long enough, and it is time to go back and pick up that shadow under the desk. Because everything I am about to tell you is one connected structure, a single plan the writers were running across the entire show, and when you see it whole for the first time, it is breathtaking. This is the part of the iceberg that I think separates Futurama from almost every other comedy ever made, because most shows that plant a mystery are improvising, hoping to figure out the answer later. Futurama planted the answer first in the opening minutes of the pilot and then spent years walking backward toward it. So, the shadow. In the pilot, as Fry sits in that chair in the cryogenics lab on the last night of 1999, feeling sorry for himself, moments before he tips backward into the freezer tube, there is a small, dark shape visible under the desk. It has two round eyes. Most people watching in 1999 did not notice it, and for those who did, it meant nothing, just an odd bit of shadow. There has been a long fan argument over the years about whether that shadow was truly present in the original broadcast or added later, and the weight of the evidence from recordings of the original airing is that it was there from day one. I will say it was widely confirmed to have been there rather than swear it on my life, because that is the honest register for a disputed fact. But the people who have checked the tapes generally agree it was always there. And here is what it was. That shadow belongs to Nibbler, the small, cute, big-eyed creature who later becomes Leela's pet, the one whose species produces the dark matter that fuels the ship. And Nibbler was not under that desk by accident. Nibbler pushed the chair. Let me lay out the full structure, because this is the payoff of three separate things I have deliberately left dangling. Nibbler is not really a pet. He is a member of an ancient, hyper-intelligent species called the Nibblonians, beings who are far older than humanity, who present themselves as adorable little animals, but who are, in fact, among the oldest and most powerful forces in the universe, and who have appointed themselves its protectors. And they have a problem. There is a species of enormous floating brains, the brain spawn, whose goal is to absorb all the knowledge in the universe and then destroy it, to make sure no new knowledge can ever exist. A kind of cosmic intellectual death. The brain spawn attack minds directly, scrambling the thoughts of any thinking being who comes near them, which makes them nearly impossible to fight, because anyone who tries to oppose them simply has their brain turned to mush. The Nibblonians have known for a very long time that the only hope of stopping the brain spawn is a single specific individual, one being in all the universe whose mind is immune to their attack, a person the brain spawn cannot read and cannot scramble. And that person is Philip J. Fry, a pizza delivery boy from 20th century New York. Why Fry? This is where the second dangling thread comes in, and it is the plot of the episode that won the series its first Emmy back in 2002, an episode where the crew accidentally travels back to the year 1947 to Roswell, New Mexico, at the exact moment of the famous supposed flying saucer incident. While they are stranded in the past, Fry manages to get his own grandfather, a young man named Enos, killed before Enos has had children. Fry panics because if his grandfather dies childless, then Fry should never be born, and yet he still exists, which he takes as proof that Enos could not really have been his grandfather. So Fry, reasoning terribly, comforts his now grieving grandmother, a young woman named Mildred, and in doing so, he sleeps with her. And she conceives. And the child she conceives is Fry's own father, which means Fry, by traveling to the past and sleeping with his grandmother, has become his own grandfather. It is a time travel paradox played for the biggest, most uncomfortable laugh the show could wring out of it, and it is the kind of thing you assume is just a great standalone gag. It is not, it is load-bearing. Because a person who is his own grandfather has an anomalous genetic makeup, and specifically, Futurama establishes Fry is missing something that every other human brain has, a particular pattern of brain activity called the delta brainwave. Fry has no delta brainwave. His parentage is a closed loop, and something in that loop left him without the one brain signal that the brain spawn used to attack and read a mind. Do you see it now? Do you see the whole shape? Fry lacks the delta brainwave because he is his own grandfather. He is his own grandfather because of the Roswell trip. His missing delta brainwave makes him the only being in the universe immune to the brain spawn. That immunity is why the Niblonians needed him, specifically him, to save the universe. And that is why, 1,000 years before he would be needed, one of them, disguised as a shadow under a desk, deliberately nudged his chair so that he would fall into the freezer and be preserved across the exact millennium required to be present for the fight. The entire premise of the series, Fry getting frozen, the accident that starts everything, was not an accident at all. It was an assassination of Fry's ordinary life, carried out by a tiny alien, to save all of existence, and it told you so in the first 30 seconds by letting you see the shadow of the being who did it. The freezing that looks like the random misfortune that kicks off a workplace comedy is actually the opening move of a cosmic rescue operation, and the payoff would not fully arrive until a 4th season episode built specifically to reveal it. An episode that goes back and shows you the pilot from Nibbler's point of view, revealing that he was there, that he pushed the chair, that it was all on purpose. I want to sit with how insane an achievement that is, from a writing standpoint, because I do not think it gets enough credit even from fans. To plant a visual clue in the opening minutes of a pilot, when you have no idea if your show will survive its first season, let alone run long enough to pay it off, and then to actually survive, and actually get to reach back 4 years later and reveal that the throwaway shadow was the linchpin of a universe-spanning plot involving your protagonist's genetics, his time travel incest paradox, and ancient species of cute immortals. And a race of world-eating brains, and to have all of those pieces locked together without contradiction is a feat of long-form plotting that most prestige dramas never manage. And Futurama did it inside a comedy, around jokes about a robot who drinks, while Fox was busy airing it out of order after football. The delta brainwave, the missing signal at the center of it all, is a perfect emblem of the whole show, an absence, a thing that is not there, that turns out to be the thing that matters more than anything about the entire series. Fry matters because of what he lacks. The universe is saved by a gap. And the writers knew that gap was coming a decade before they filled it in, which is why I keep saying this is not a show that hides secrets. Exactly. It is a show that keeps promises very slowly to anyone patient enough to still be watching when they come due. That patience, that habit of hiding things and trusting the audience to find them, reaches its purest form in the layer we are descending into now, which is the part of the iceberg where the series stops hiding jokes in the plot and starts hiding them in the actual writing on the walls. Because scattered throughout Futurama, on signs, on storefronts, on packaging, on graffiti, in the background of shots you are not meant to be looking at, there is text written in an alien alphabet. And it is not gibberish. It is a real code, and it says real things, and the writers put it there knowing that most people would never even try to read it, purely for the joy of the ones who would. The show has in fact 2 separate alien writing systems, and the story of how fans crack them is one of the great pieces of Futurama folklore. The first one, which fans came to call Alienese, and which is sometimes referred to as the first alien language, is a straightforward substitution cipher, That means each alien symbol stands for exactly one letter of the English alphabet, a simple one-to-one swap. The kind of code you might have made as a child, where a picture always means the same letter. Because it is a direct substitution, it is crackable the way any substitution cipher is crackable, by looking at which symbols appear most often, guessing that the commonest symbols map to common letters like E and T, finding short words, and slowly building up the key. Fans figured it out relatively quickly once they realized the background text was consistent from episode to episode and worth the effort. And once you have the key, the whole future opens up to you. Suddenly, every sign in the background is legible, and you discover that the writers have been leaving little jokes, labels, and asides in plain sight the entire time. Comments visible only to the people willing to sit with a freeze frame and a pencil. There is something delightful about that, a second layer of comedy painted onto the sets, addressed to an audience the writers could only hope existed. But here is where it gets beautiful, and where you can feel the mathematicians in the room stretching their legs. Once the first alphabet was solved and widely known, the writers did not stop putting hidden messages in the series. They just made the code harder. They introduced a second alien writing system, a second cipher, and this one is not a simple substitution. This one is what is known as a modular addition cipher, sometimes described as an auto-key cipher, and the difference is the whole point. In the first code, a symbol always means the same letter, so you can decode it piece by piece, one symbol at a time, in isolation. In the second code, that is deliberately impossible. The value of each symbol depends on the symbols that came before it. To work out what a given glyph means, you have to know the running total of all the letters preceding it, adding them up according to a rule and wrapping around, so that the same symbol in two different places can mean two entirely different letters depending on its context. You cannot decode it character by character. You have to track the accumulating state of the whole message as you go. Think about what that means for the fans trying to crack it. With the first code, once you had the key, you were done. Every message everywhere fell open. With the second code, having a partial answer does not immediately give you the rest, because the system is designed so that each letter's meaning is entangled with its neighbors. It is a fundamentally more sophisticated piece of cryptography, and it took fans considerably longer to break, years rather than weeks, precisely because it resists the easy frequency analysis approach that cracked the first one. And the reason it exists at all is, to me, one of the great pieces of quiet pettiness in television history. The writers made a code. Fans solved it. So the writers, rather than giving up on the game, sat down and engineered a harder code, specifically to give the fans a bigger challenge, a second mountain to climb once they had summited the first. That is not something you do for ratings. Nobody at the network was asking for a second, more mathematically robust alien cipher. That is something you do purely for love, for the private pleasure of the game between the people who make Futurama and the tiny devoted audience who take it apart frame by frame. This second cipher is associated in the series lore with the Neblonians, the ancient species we just spent so long on, which is a fitting home for it. A language of secrets belonging to the oldest keepers of secrets in the universe. Let me be careful and honest here, because this is exactly the kind of territory where it would be easy for me to start reciting specific decoded messages to sound impressive, and I am not going to do that unless I can stand behind it, because the whole ethic of a channel like this falls apart the moment I hand you an invented answer dressed up as a fact. What I can tell you with confidence is the structure. There are two alien alphabets. The first is a simple substitution and was cracked quickly. The second is a context-dependent modular cipher and took far longer to break. Both were placed in the background of the series as an ongoing, optional puzzle for anyone who wanted it. What the specific hidden messages say, sign by sign, is the kind of detail I would rather point you toward the dedicated fan resources for, the infosphere and the Futurama wikis where people have painstakingly cataloged the translations, than risk paraphrasing wrong here in the dark. The point I actually want you to carry away is not any one decoded gag. It is the mindset. This is a show that treated its own background art as a cryptographic playground, that assumed a mathematician's audience, that made the reading itself a form of play. And when that audience proved they were up to it, the show's response was not to reward them and stop. It was to raise the difficulty. There is a kind of respect in that, a refusal to condescend, that I find rare. Most entertainment is designed to be understood instantly by as many people as possible. Futurama built rooms in itself that could only be entered with effort, and then furnished them anyway for the few who would ever walk in. And this is the perfect on-ramp to the next layer down, the coldest and most precise part of the whole iceberg, because the ciphers are really just the writers warming up. The alien alphabets are cryptography as a hobby, a bit of fun with letters. But the same room, the same overqualified minds took that same instinct, that same willingness to bury real intellectual work in a cartoon where almost no one would find it, and they applied it not to language but to mathematics. And what they hid down there is not a code you can look up in a key. It is a genuine, original piece of mathematics invented from scratch for a plot and never done before or since in quite that way. So let's keep descending into the numbers. The headline artifact of this layer is a thing fans call the Futurama theorem, and to understand why it is remarkable, you have to understand the problem it was invented to solve, which was a plot problem, not a math problem, which is what makes the whole thing so strange and wonderful. In a later episode from the Comedy Central era, the professor and Amy build a machine that can swap two people's minds, moving one person's consciousness into the other person's body and vice versa. The crew, being who they are, immediately start using it for various selfish and chaotic reasons, swapping minds all over the place. But the machine has a flaw deliberately written into the plot to create the crisis. It cannot be used on the same pair of bodies more than once. Once two particular bodies have swapped minds, that exact pair can never swap again directly. So after a whole afternoon of everyone swapping into everyone else, the crew finds themselves scrambled, minds in the wrong bodies, and no way to simply reverse the swaps they already made, because the machine will not repeat a pairing. That is the setup. Now, is it actually possible, using only new pairs of bodies that have not swapped with each other before, to get everyone back into their own body? And if so, how? This is a genuine mathematical question. A question in the branch of mathematics that deals with permutations, with the ways you can rearrange a set of things. And when the writers reached this point in the story, they realized they did not just want to handwave the solution, they wanted it to actually work, to be actually correct. So one of the writers, Ken Keeler, the one with a doctorate in applied mathematics from Harvard, sat down and proved it. He proved that no matter how badly a group of minds and bodies has been scrambled, no matter how tangled the permutation, you can always get everyone back to their original body using the machine, as long as you are allowed to bring in two fresh people, two individuals who have not swapped with anyone yet. Those two extra people act as a kind of clean workspace, a pair of temporary containers you can route minds through, and with them you can always untangle any mess, and then they themselves can be restored at the end. At most two extra bodies. That is the theorem. It works for any number of people, any arrangement. And here is the thing that makes it legendary. This was not an existing theorem that Keeler looked up and dropped into the script. He invented it. He created a new, original piece of mathematics specifically to resolve the plot of a cartoon episode, a theorem that, as far as anyone can tell, had never been stated or proven before, because no one had previously had a reason to ask exactly that question. It is often described as the first time a new mathematical theorem was created purely to serve a television plot. And they did not hide it exactly the way they hid the ciphers. They put the proof on screen. In the episode, the solution is worked out on a whiteboard, the actual mathematical reasoning visible in the shot, real notation, a real argument. The genuine proof that the writer had derived, presented in the middle of a comedy about people swapping bodies. A tired viewer watching at midnight sees some scribbles on a board and a funny resolution to a farce. A mathematician watching sees a correct original proof of a real theorem, published, in effect, not in a journal, but in an episode of a science fiction cartoon. I find that almost unbearably charming. It is the purest possible expression of what this show is, real intellectual work, done for its own sake, smuggled into a place where it was under no obligation to be real at all, and made real anyway, out of pride, out of love, out of the sheer refusal to fake something you could actually do properly. But the theorem is only the crown jewel. The number hiding in Futurama goes much deeper and much more constantly than that one episode, and once you know what to look for, you start seeing it everywhere. Because the writers had favorite numbers, and one number in particular runs through the entire series like a signature carved into the woodwork. That number is 1729. To understand why that number, you have to know a famous old story from the history of mathematics. There is a tale about two mathematicians, Godfrey Hardy and the brilliant self-taught Indian mathematician Srinivasa Ramanujan. Hardy went to visit Ramanujan, who was ill, and, making conversation, mentioned that he had arrived in a taxicab numbered 1729, and remarked that it seemed a rather dull, unremarkable number. And Ramanujan immediately replied that no, on the contrary, it was a very interesting number, because it is the smallest number that can be written as the sum of two cubes in two different ways. That property being expressible as a sum of two cubes in more than one way, made that particular number famous among mathematicians forever after, and numbers with that kind of property came to be associated with that story. It is one of the best-loved anecdotes in all of mathematics, exactly the kind of thing the Futurama writers would have grown up loving. So they hit it. Everywhere, Bender, our robot, is a bending unit, and his unit number is 1729. His serial number, a different, longer number, was also chosen with intent, because it too, when you do the arithmetic, turns out to be expressible as a sum of two cubes, carrying the exact mathematical property from the Ramanujan story hidden inside the identification number of a cartoon robot. In an early Xmas episode, a card reveals that Bender is his mother's 1729th offspring. The starship belonging to the pompous Zap Brannigan carries a registration number built around that same figure. And in a later episode about parallel universes, which we will get to shortly, one of the alternate universes the crew encounters carries, you guessed it, that same number. The writers salted their favorite mathematical in-joke through years of episodes, in the background, on props, in throwaway numbers that the vast majority of viewers would read as random, purely so that the handful of people who recognized the significance would feel the little jolt of recognition, would know that someone in the room shared their strange affection for a 100-year-old story about a taxicab. It is a wink across decades and disciplines, and it is completely invisible unless you already know to look. The math and horror crossover is worth its own moment, because there is a creepy freeze frame gag built on binary numbers that is one of my favorite tiny things in the whole show. In a second season episode that parodies haunted car and werewolf stories, Bender comes to fear that he is possessed, that there is something evil inside him, and at one point he looks into a mirror, and reflected there he sees a number written on himself, a string of ones and zeros, the binary number 1, 0, 1, 0, 0, 1, 1, 0, 1, 0. To a normal viewer, it is just spooky robot gibberish, a scary-looking string of digits. But binary is just a way of writing numbers, and if you actually convert that particular string of ones and zeros from binary into an ordinary number, it comes out to exactly 666, the number of the beast, the traditional mark of the devil. The series wrote the number of the beast in the language of computers, so that a robot's horror movie moment would be mathematically literal, so that the digital creature would meet the devil in the only notation a machine truly speaks. And they never explained it. They just put the binary on the mirror and trusted that somebody, someday, would do the conversion and feel the little chill of getting the joke. That is the whole method again, in miniature. A surface that works if you see nothing, and a hidden floor beneath it that rewards you if you do the arithmetic. There are more of these than I could fit into a single night, honestly. Futurama is dense with mathematical and scientific jokes calibrated for people who did the reading. References to infinities, to famous constants, to real physics, dropped into signage and dialogue and set dressing. There is, for instance, the recurring joke of a movie theater named after a specific kind of mathematical infinity, the smallest infinite number, which is a wonderful piece of nonsense if you happen to know that different infinities have different sizes and names, and pure background texture if you do not. The consistent principle behind all of it is the one we have now watched it apply at every level, from the plot to the alphabet to the numbers on the props. Futurama is built so that it loses nothing if you know none of this, and gains an entire second show if you know some of it. The jokes on the surface carry the episode. The jokes underneath carry a relationship, a private conversation between a room full of overeducated writers and the slice of the audience who could meet them there. And the astonishing thing, the thing I keep coming back to, is that they did all this extra, invisible, unrewarded work for a show that Fox kept trying to cancel. That aired out of order, that no one was paying to be this smart. They did it because they were the kind of people who could not help it, who would rather bury a real theorem in a cartoon than fake one, and the whole strange, beautiful bottom half of this iceberg is made of that refusal to fake it. Let's move sideways for a stretch now into the deep cuts, the odd corners and strange biology and buried episodes that do not fit neatly into the emotional arc or the math, but that make the world feel as lived in and peculiar as it does. Because a lot of what gives Futurama its texture is not the grand long game. It is the specificity of its weirdness, the way it commits to strange rules and strange creatures with a straight face. Take one of the best loved and most ambitious episodes of the original run, an episode that is, on its surface, a love letter to a different show entirely. It aired in the spring of 2002, and its premise is that in the 31st century, the original Star Trek has been outlawed. Not just canceled, outlawed, banned as a dangerous religion, because a cult of obsessive fans had grown so fervent in their devotion that the authorities decided the whole thing had to be suppressed. Every copy of the series was gathered up, and the surviving episodes, the 79 original episodes, along with the films, were loaded onto a rocket and fired into deep space, to a forbidden planet, so that humanity could be rid of the temptation. It is a joke about fandom itself, about the show's own kind of obsessive audience, told with enormous affection and a little bit of a warning. And to make it, the writers pulled off something remarkable. They brought in the actual surviving cast of the original Star Trek, the real actors, William Shatner, Leonard Nimoy, and the others, to voice versions of themselves preserved into the future, drawn back into the story. It has been noted as one of the last times so many of that original cast recorded together, which gives the whole thing a bittersweet weight in hindsight. The crew arrives on the forbidden planet to find the actors held captive by an enormous, godlike energy being, a glowing entity who is, underneath his terrifying power, simply the single most intense Star Trek fan in the universe. A lonely creature who kidnapped his idols because he loved the series more than anything and had no other way to be near it. His name is spelled with an absurd surplus of the letter L, and he is one of Futurama's great one-off creations, a monster whose entire menace comes from being a fan who cannot let go. There is a great deal of the series' own relationship with its audience buried in that character. A gentle joke about the danger and the tenderness of loving something too much, told by a show that inspired, and still inspires, exactly that kind of love. That episode is also the clearest example of one of the series' cleverest structural tricks, the one I mentioned much earlier, the heads in jars as a machine for guest stars. Because the way you get the real cast of an old show into a program set 1,000 years in the future is that in this universe, famous people persist as living, talking heads preserved in liquid, so any celebrity, any historical figure can simply be present, on a shelf, ready to be part of the story. It is a device that solves a real production problem, how to feature real famous people in the far future, and turns it into a running joke and a piece of world building at the same time. The series used it constantly, and it means the future of Futurama is populated, shelf after shelf, by the preserved heads of real people, a museum of celebrity that doubles as the show's guest star green room. It is efficient, and it is eerie, and it is very funny, all at once, which is a combination this show hits more often than almost anything else on television. Now let's talk about the biology, because the alien biology in Futurama is one of its most committed and least discussed pleasures. And two examples in particular reframe entire characters once you understand them. The first is Kif, the put-upon green lieutenant who spends his life sighing at the incompetent Zap Brannigan and loving Amy. There is an episode about Kif becoming pregnant, and the mechanics of it are an inventive piece of invented xenobiology. Kif belongs to a species that reproduces in a way completely unlike humans. Members of his species become receptive to reproduction through the experience of love, and when a member of his species is in that receptive state, they absorb genetic material through touch, from the first being who makes skin contact with them. In this case, through a mix-up, the first person to touch the receptive Kif was Leela, meaning Leela's genetic material is what he absorbs and carries. But the species also has a concept, a specific term for the true beloved, the emotional parent, the one whose love made the reproduction possible in the first place. And for Kif, that is Amy. So the child Kif carries and eventually gives birth to, as a batch of tiny, tadpole-like young, has a biological contributor and a spiritual, chosen parent who are two different people. And Futurama treats the distinction with total seriousness inside its own invented rules. It is a surprisingly tender piece of writing about non-traditional parenthood, smuggled as usual inside a gross-out premise about a man giving birth to tadpoles. Futurama keeps doing this. It keeps using the freedom of science fiction and animation to say something warm about how families actually form, and then hiding it under a joke so you do not feel lectured. The second piece of biology reframes Zoidberg, the crew's hapless, penniless lobster doctor, and it is dark once you sit with it. Zoidberg species, the Decapodians, come from an ocean planet, and they reproduce according to a brutal biological rule. They do not mate throughout their lives the way humans do. They spend the vast majority of their existence unable to reproduce at all, and then, driven by an overwhelming instinct, they return to their home planet in a great gathering. They mate in a single frenzied event, and then they die. Reproduction, for Zoidberg's kind, is the end of life, not a part of it. You mate once, and mating kills you. And when you understand that, Zoidberg becomes a much sadder and stranger figure than the comic punching bag he appears to be. Here is a creature for whom the deepest biological drive, the urge toward love and reproduction, is literally fatal, who must choose between never fulfilling the central purpose of his biology and dying to fulfill it. His endless loneliness, his poverty, the way the crew treats him as expendable, all of it sits on top of a species-level tragedy, that to love in the way his body demands is to die. The series plays Zoidberg almost entirely for laughs. The broke, smelly, unwanted friend nobody appreciates. And then underneath, if you look, there is this bleak biological fact, the reproduce and perish rule, giving his whole clownish existence a shadow. I do not think most casual viewers ever register it. But it is there, consistent, canonical, and it is one more example of the thing this show does more reliably than any comedy I know, which is to build a real, load-bearing sadness underneath a character you were invited to laugh at, and to leave it there for anyone who cares to notice. There is a whole population of these deeper characters and running concepts I could keep pulling up from this level, the robot theology we touched on, the elaborate bureaucracy of the future, the mutants in the sewers whose plight becomes a genuine civil rights thread across the later seasons, the recurring villains at the corporation run by a ruthless businesswoman known simply as Mom, whose sweet public image hides a monstrous private cruelty. The point of pausing at this level is not to catalog every one of them. It is to show you that the density is everywhere, that Futurama did not just have one clever engineered plot and a stack of good jokes, but that nearly every corner of the world, down to the reproductive biology of a minor character, was thought through with the same care, given the same double layer of a laugh on top and something real underneath. It is a show that rewards attention at literally every scale, from a decade-long story arc down to a single alien's tragic anatomy, and that consistency, that refusal to let any corner of the world be lazy, is a huge part of why it has lasted, why it keeps pulling people back down for another look. We are near the floor of all this now, in the coldest, darkest water, and this is where I want to lay out the actual rules of this universe, the load-bearing laws the series established and then, crucially, honored, even when honoring them meant killing people and closing doors it could never reopen. Because a lot of what makes Futurama's deep lore feel so weighty, rather than weightless like most cartoon continuity, is that the show took its own rules seriously. Things that happen, stay happened. People who die tend to stay dead. And the mechanics of time and identity in this world are surprisingly strict, surprisingly unforgiving, once you map them out. Start with time travel, because it has a very specific and very sad relationship with it. The default rule, established in the Emmy-winning episode we sat with earlier, the one with the forward-only machine, is that time travel goes in one direction. Forward. You can ride into the future, but you cannot come back. And that one-way street is not a technicality, it is a philosophy. Futurama believes structurally, in its very physics, that the past is gone and unreachable, that you cannot undo what has been done, that the only direction available to anyone is onward into whatever comes next. That is why the crew, stranded in that machine, had no option but to ride all the way to the end of the universe. Going back was never on the table. The universe of Futurama is built so that regret has no mechanism, so that you cannot fix the past because you cannot reach it. And that constraint is the source of a great deal of Futurama's melancholy. The one-way arrow of time is not just a plot device here, it is the emotional law of the whole series. There is exactly one significant exception, and the series made it as dark as possible, which I love, because it refused to let backward time travel be a free gift. In the first of the direct-to-DVD films, a mechanism is introduced that does allow travel into the past, a time code hidden in a tattoo that lets people go back. But it comes with a terrible catch, a rule the film establishes and then enforces mercilessly. Any duplicate created by going back in time is doomed. If you travel to the past and, in doing so, create a copy of a person, a paradox duplicate, that duplicate cannot be allowed to persist. The universe does not tolerate the paradox indefinitely. The doomed duplicate is fated to die, and the film treats this not as a loophole to be escaped, but as an iron law to be obeyed. This is where a character sometimes referred to as Lars comes from, a duplicate of Fry created through the time code, a man who is Fry, who lives a real life, who loves and is loved, and who is nonetheless marked for death from the moment he exists because he is a paradox duplicate, and the rules of this universe say such duplicates are doomed. The show did not have to make that rule. It could have used backward time travel the way 100 other stories do, as a reset button, a way to fix things. Instead, it made backward time travel a way to create people who are born already condemned, whose entire existence is a debt the universe will call in. And it used that same grim machinery to reach back and touch the fate of the dog we spoke about, weaving even that softening into a rule about duplicates who cannot be allowed to last. Time travel in Futurama is never free. Forward, you lose everyone you left behind. Backward, you create someone the universe will have to kill. Either way, there is a price, and the series always makes you pay it. The strictness extends to death itself, and specifically to Bender, whose mortality is one of the quiet, load-bearing facts in the whole series, precisely because it is so easy to miss. Most robots in this universe are functionally immortal in a specific way. When a robot is destroyed, its consciousness, its memory, its self can be uploaded, backed up, transferred to a new body. Death, for a standard robot, is an inconvenience, a matter of restoring from a backup. But Bender is not a standard robot in this respect. Bender, it is established, was built without a backup unit. He has no backup. There is no saved copy of him waiting to be loaded into a fresh chassis, which means that Bender, alone among his kind, can actually permanently die. If Bender is destroyed, there is no restoring him. He is gone, the way a person is gone, and this reframes the character completely once you hold it in mind. Bender spends the whole series behaving as though nothing matters, as though he is invincible and consequence-free, drinking and stealing and throwing himself into danger with total abandon. And underneath all of that bravado is the fact that he, uniquely, has everything to lose because he is the one robot who cannot come back. His recklessness is not the recklessness of an immortal. It is the recklessness of the one machine in the room who is as mortal as the humans he pretends to look down on. There is even a grimness to his origins here, tied back to that darkest of the series' running jokes, because Bender was manufactured as an industrial bending unit, and Futurama has connected the purpose of bending girders to the construction of those very suicide booths on the street corners. The friendly drunk who is Fry's best friend was built in part to help make the machines a hopeless person steps into to die. That is the kind of detail the series buries and never dwells on, and it gives Bender a shadow as long as anyone's on the series. Then there is the matter of other universes, because Futurama, like a lot of science fiction, has parallel worlds, but the way it handles them is characteristically specific and characteristically a little heartbreaking. In an episode about a box that contains an entire alternate universe, the professor discovers that reality has branched, that there is another universe sitting inside a box in the lab, complete with alternate versions of the whole crew. And the rule the show establishes for how these universes differ is beautifully simple and a little devastating. The universes diverge on coin flips. Every point where a coin could land one way or the other, the two universes split, one taking each outcome, so that the alternate universe is the accumulated result of every coin having landed the opposite way. It sounds trivial and it is played for laughs until you get to the specific difference that matters, which is that in the alternate universe, the one built on all the opposite coin flips, Fry and Leela are happily married. In our universe, the main one, the one we follow, Fry and Leela spend most of the series circling each other, missing each other, not quite together, all that longing and hesitation and near misses. And it reveals in a box in the lab a version of them where a few coins landed differently and they simply found each other easily and built a life. There is something almost unbearable in that, the idea that the difference between the love story you got and the one you wanted might be nothing more than the way some coins fell, that in the space of a few flips there is a version of these people who got the happiness this version had to fight so hard for so many years to even approach. The series does not belabor it. It just shows you the other couple, content in their box, and lets you feel the weight of how close and how far that happiness is. And finally, at the very bottom, there is the largest rule of all, which is that in Futurama, the universe itself is not permanent. It can end, and it can begin again. We touched this when we spoke about the ride to the end of time, but it is worth stating as a law because it is the deepest law the series has. The cosmos in this universe is cyclical. It runs down, it ends, and then, through the machinery the series invented, it can restart, sometimes recreating itself so precisely that the same history plays out again. The same people, the same moments, repeating. Existence is not a line with a beginning and an end. It is a loop or a series of loops, death and rebirth at the scale of everything. And I think this is the belief that sits underneath the entire show, underneath the jokes and the math and the sad dogs and the frozen man. Everything ends and everything comes back and everything ends again. Fry froze and came back. The show was canceled and came back. The universe dies and comes back. The whole thing at every scale is about the same pattern, loss and return, ending and beginning, the refusal of things to simply stay finished, It is, when you lay all the rules side by side, a strangely hopeful physics for such a melancholy show. Nothing is permanent, including, mercifully, the endings. Which brings us to one of the shrewdest, most self-aware layers of the whole iceberg, the way Futurama keeps looking at itself sideways, at the roads it did not take, at the versions of itself that might have been. Because Futurama is unusually obsessed, even by science fiction standards, with alternatives, with what-ifs, with the deliberate exploration of paths not taken, and it built a whole recurring device just to indulge that obsession. The professor, at some point, builds a machine whose entire function is to answer hypothetical questions, a what-if machine into which a character can pose a question. What if I had done this? What if the world were like that? And the machine plays out the scenario as a little self-contained vignette. These segments are explicitly not part of the main continuity. They are the series stepping outside its own story to imagine, freely, what would happen if the rules were different, if a character had made another choice, if the whole premise were tilted a few degrees. And it uses these as a playground, running scenarios that could never happen in the real continuity, killing characters, ending the world, rewriting history, all under the safe frame of the machine's hypotheticals. I find that device strangely honest for a piece of comedy machinery because it says out loud what most fiction only does in secret, which is stand at a fork in a life and stare down the road nobody walked. A lesser show would use it once and move on. This one keeps wandering back to the fork, unable to look away. What I find fascinating about that device, sitting here at the very floor of this dive, is how it rhymes with everything else the series is doing. We just spent a whole stretch on the parallel universe in the box, on the alternate crew where a few coins fell differently, on doomed duplicates, on a universe that ends and restarts into slightly altered recreations of itself. The what-if machine is another instance of the same fixation, the same restless question that runs under the entire series, which is, what else could have happened? What if Fry had not been frozen? What if the coin had landed the other way? What if you could see the life you did not live? Futurama returns to that question compulsively from every angle, in the sad register and the silly register alike. And I do not think that is an accident. This is a show made by people who were, structurally, thinking about roads not taken, about the fragility of the particular path that leads to any particular life. And it is a show whose own existence was a series of roads that very nearly were not taken, cancellations survived, revivals granted, a whole timeline where Futurama simply ended in 2003, and none of the rest of it ever happened. The show's obsession with alternate versions of itself is, I think, inseparable from the fact that it kept nearly ceasing to exist. When your own show keeps almost dying, you become very interested in the other timelines, the ones where it did, and that self-awareness became, over the years, one of Futurama's richest veins of comedy, because Futurama knew exactly what was happening to it and folded that knowledge into the work. This is a series that has ended, on purpose, as a deliberate, crafted finale at least 3 separate times, and possibly more depending on how you count the send-off film that was meant to be the last word before cable rescued it. Each of those endings was written to work as a goodbye because each time the people making it believed it might be. And rather than pretend otherwise, the series leaned into its own doom. It made jokes about executives, about cancellation, about being pulled off the air and brought back. It built its later episodes with a knowing wink about its own improbable survival, a show fully aware that it was a thing that kept dying and refusing to stay dead. There is a specific kind of comedy that only a repeatedly canceled show can make, a gallows humor about its own mortality, and Futurama became a master of it, because it had so much practice. Most shows get one ending if they are lucky, and it is either earned or it is abrupt. Futurama got to write its ending over and over to keep saying goodbye and then walking back in the door, and each farewell got a little more knowing, a little more layered with the awareness that it might not be the last after all. I think that repeated experience of ending is actually why Futurama is so good at endings, why episodes like the Frozen Lifetime finale hit as hard as they do. When you have had to say goodbye as many times as this show has, you get good at it. You learn what a real ending needs, which is not spectacle, but the sense of a life fully lived and freely chosen. And the series applied that hard-won skill not just to its finales, but throughout, to the dog who waited, to the brother who named his son, to the parents in the sewers, to every small story about time running out and love outlasting it. Futurama is a show that was forced by its own troubled production to become an expert in the very subject it was already obsessed with, which is how things end and whether anything of them survives the ending. The network kept giving it opportunities to practice mortality, and it took every one of them, and it got better every time. There is a whole body of the show that lives outside the episodes too, at this level of the iceberg, the expanded material that die-hard fans know and casual viewers never touch. There have been comic books continuing the crew's adventures, video games, tie-in material, the 4 films we discussed that occupy their own strange canonical status, both movies and, when recut, episodes. Not all of it carries the same weight as it itself, and the series canon has always been a slightly loose and forgiving thing, willing to contradict itself for a good joke, willing to retcon a fate when it wanted to, as it did with the dog. But the existence of all that surrounding material speaks to the same thing everything at this depth speaks to, which is a world people did not want to leave, that generated more of itself in every available medium because the appetite for it outran what any single network was willing to make. Futurama kept getting canceled, and the world kept refusing to close, spilling out into comics and games and films, and eventually a whole new streaming era continuation, as if the universe of Futurama had the same property as the universe inside Futurama, the one that ends and restarts and cannot be made to simply stop. That refusal to close is to me the most Futurama thing about Futurama, more than any robot or any gag. The world would not stay shut. There is something oddly hopeful in that, in a thing enough people love simply outlasting every attempt to end it. I have been circling the love story this whole time, touching it and pulling back the way the series itself does, and I think it deserves its own descent, because the relationship between Fry and Leela is, when you strip everything else away, the actual spine of the entire series, the thread that all the time travel and the math and the sad dogs are ultimately in service of. If you had to say what Futurama is about, underneath everything, I do not think the honest answer is the future or science or comedy. I think the honest answer is a delivery boy who's not very smart and a starship captain who's far too good for him, and the 1,000 small ways the show keeps them apart and keeps bringing them almost together across 15 years and 4 cancellations. Here's the shape of it, and the series plays it with remarkable patience. Fry falls for Leela early, and honestly, he is, by any reasonable measure, not her equal. He is a slacker, a man frozen out of a dead-end life in the 20th century, lazy and dim and often selfish. Leela is competent, disciplined, brave, the one who holds the crew together, a woman who spent her whole life believing she was alone and armored herself accordingly, as we saw when we went down to her origins. On paper, it is a mismatch, and Futurama never pretends otherwise. Leela spends years not taking Fry seriously as a romantic possibility, dating other people, holding him at arm's length, and the series lets that be real, lets her have every reason to keep him at a distance. What it does, across all those years, is slowly, patiently show us the thing about Fry that makes him worth it, which is that his love for Leela is the one thing in his aimless life that is completely without calculation. He is not clever enough to be strategic about it. He just loves her, plainly, stupidly, entirely, and every so often that pure, uncomplicated devotion breaks through and does something that his cleverer, more accomplished rivals never manage. The clearest example, and the one it chose to end its original run on, is the episode where Fry tries to express his feelings through music. Fry cannot play an instrument, but he wants, more than anything, to play a particular difficult and beautiful instrument well enough to perform a piece he has written for Leela, to say through music what he cannot say in words. And because this is Futurama, he pursues that longing straight into a deal with the robot devil, trading his way into a pair of hands skilled enough to play, the binding infernal bargain we walked through earlier. He composes an entire opera for her about them. And on the night of the performance, the deal comes due, and the borrowed skill is stripped away from him mid-performance so that his hands, in front of the whole audience, in front of Leela, revert to their own clumsy, untalented selves, and the music falls apart into fumbling, tuneless noise. Fry, humiliated, keeps playing anyway, badly, because it is the only way he has to finish telling her how he feels. And Leela, who could walk out, who has walked away from him 100 times before, stays. She comes up onto the stage and asks him to keep going, to finish the piece, badly, because she has finally understood that the clumsiness is not the failure. The clumsiness is the truth. A perfect performance would have been the robot devils. Borrowed, false. The broken one is Fry's, and it is real, and she would rather hear the real broken thing he made for her than any perfect thing he did not. That was the ending Fox went out on, and it is almost unbearably well chosen because it says everything the show believes about these two people in a single image. She does not love him because he is impressive. She loves him because he is sincere, and sincerity in this show's moral universe beats talent every single time. And then the series got canceled and came back and got canceled and came back, and each time it returned, it kept working on these two, kept testing them, kept letting them drift together and apart, refusing to either rush them into a tidy couple or cruelly keep them apart forever. It showed us, as we saw far down in the dark, the other universe where a coin fell differently and they were simply easily married, which functions almost as a promise, a glimpse of the destination the main story was slowly walking toward. And it finally, in the ending it wrote when everyone was sure it was truly over for good, gave them a whole lifetime together, an entire quiet old age spent side by side in a stopped world, and gave them the choice to have that life again, and let them say yes. I will not walk back through that ending, we sat with it properly already, but I want to name what it means placed against the Holophone finale because the two bookends tell the whole story. At the first ending, Leela stays to hear Fry finish a broken song. At the last ending, Fry and Leela choose to live their whole broken, beautiful life over again. It is the same gesture grown up, staying to hear the rest of it, choosing the real, imperfect thing on purpose. The series spent 15 years and a small fortune of canceled seasons making the same quiet argument over and over, that love is not about getting the perfect version, it is about staying for the broken one. And it made that argument through two cartoon characters, one of whom cannot play an instrument and one of whom has a single enormous eye. And it made it land harder than most live-action romances manage in their entire runs. That is the thing I most want people who dismiss this show as just a wacky sci-fi comedy to understand. The comedy is great, the robot and the jokes and the aliens are great, but they are the delivery system. They are the pizza box. And inside the box, the whole time was this, a patient, decades-long, interrupted, resurrected love story about two mismatched people and the slow miracle of them choosing each other, told by a show that itself kept getting left and kept coming back, that itself kept playing on badly after the music should have stopped, that itself refused to walk off the stage. When people say they cried at Futurama, this is usually where, at the exact point where the funniest show on television reveals that it was a love story the whole time, and that it meant it. There's one more piece of Fry I want to bring up from the dark because it is the loneliest thing in the entire show and it hides in plain sight behind his goofiness. And it is the piece that, more than any theorem or cipher, tells you what kind of story you have actually been watching. Fry is the last person of his time. Think about what the premise actually means, stripped of the comedy. Fry did not travel to the future. He was left behind by the past. Everyone he ever knew, his parents, his brother, his friends, the girl he was seeing, the dog we spoke about, every single person alive when he was frozen, lived out their entire lives and grew old and died 1,000 years before he opened his eyes. He is not a visitor to the 31st century. He is a survivor of the 20th, the only one, a man whose entire world, every face he loved, is 1,000 years in the grave. And the series mostly lets him be too dim and too cheerful to dwell on it, which is its own kind of mercy. But every so often it pulls the curtain back and lets you see the size of what he lost. We already went down to the two clearest instances, the brother who named his son after him and the dog who waited, so I will not walk through those again. But notice what they have in common now that we can see the pattern whole. Both of them are about Fry discovering, too late, across an unbridgeable gulf of time, that he was loved by someone he can never reach. That is the specific shape of his grief. It is not just that his people are dead, it is that he keeps finding out, 1,000 years afterward, how much they cared, and there is nothing he can do with the knowledge, no way to answer it, no way to go back, because, as we established at the very bottom of the ice, in this universe you cannot go back. The one-way arrow of time is not an abstract rule for Fry. It is the wall between him and everyone he ever belonged to. And Futurama, in one of its later returns, did something extraordinarily tender with that, letting Fry revisit, through the machinery of memory and technology, the last day before he was frozen and giving him the chance to do the one thing the whole premise had denied him, to say a real goodbye to his mother, who loved him and lost him without ever knowing what happened to her boy. I will not spoil the details, but it is the show doing for Fry what it does for all its characters, reaching back into an old wound and offering not a fix, because there is no fix, but a moment of grace, a goodbye that the original tragedy never allowed. And this is where I think the deepest reading of the whole show lives, deeper than any freeze-frame joke. Futurama looks like a show about the future, and it is the opposite. It is a show about the past, about loss, about the specific ache of being cut off from the people and the time that made you. Fry is the audience's way into that ache, an ordinary man carried 1,000 years from home and forced to build a new life among strangers, aliens, robots, and a one-eyed captain, precisely because everything and everyone from his old life is gone. The comedy of the future, the flying cars and the suicide booths and the president in a jar is the strange new country he wakes up into. But the emotional engine underneath is homesickness, a homesickness so extreme that home is not just another place. It is another millennium, permanently sealed off behind the wall of time. When people talk about how Futurama can make you cry, I think they are responding, without always naming it, to that buried homesickness, to the fact that behind every joke is a man who lost his entire world and is, bravely, making a new one anyway, out of the odd collection of misfits he happened to be thawed among. And here's the turn, the thing that keeps the series from being unbearable. He does make a new one. The crew of that delivery ship, the ancient nephew and the criminal robot and the captain and the intern and the bureaucrat and the broke lobster doctor become, over the seasons, a real family, chosen rather than born, assembled out of whoever was there. That is the answer it offers to its own central grief. You cannot get the old world back, but you can, if you are lucky and you stay open to it, be unalone again, among new people, in a new time. The frozen man from the dead century finds, at the end of everything, a home and a love he never had in the life he lost. That is not a small thing to say. That is about as generous a thing as a piece of television can say to a person watching alone in the dark, which, given the format, is probably how you are watching it right now. Let's surface just slightly from the emotional depths and look at another layer that runs through the whole iceberg, the political and social satire, because Futurama has a sharper and more consistent view of society than it usually gets credit for, and it is worth pulling out into the light. I said much earlier that the future in this show is not a utopia and not quite a dystopia, that it is the present with better toys, and the fuller version of that idea is that Futurama's future is a world where all of our current injustices have simply been carried forward, automated, and given a shiny sci-fi coat of paint. Futurama almost never preaches about this. It just builds it into the setting and lets the injustice sit there in the background as normal, which is a much more damning way to satirize something than a lecture. The clearest example is the mutants. We went down to Leela's origins and found that she is a mutant, not an alien, and that mutants live hidden in the sewers beneath New York. But the fuller shape of that is a genuine underclass, a whole population of people born different by an accident of mutation, who are legally forbidden from living on the surface, forced underground, out of sight, into the literal sewers of the city, treated as something less than the humans and aliens who walk in the light above them. That is not a throwaway gag. It is a fully realized system of segregation built into the world, and the series returns to it across the later seasons, developing it into a real civil rights thread, with the mutants pushing back against the laws that confine them, demanding the right to come up into the daylight. Leela's whole story, the fact that her parents gave her up specifically so she could pass, could be taken for an acceptable kind of different rather than the forbidden kind, is a story about passing, about a family sacrificing their child's knowledge of who she is so that she can have the life the surface world would deny a known mutant. That is heavy, real, recognizable material, and the show carries it lightly enough that you can miss it, but it is absolutely there. A sustained argument about how societies decide who is allowed to be seen. Then there is the corporate satire, which the series delivers mostly through a single magnificent villain, a businesswoman known simply as Mom, who runs the enormous corporation that manufactures most of the robots and technology in this world, very much including the robots the crew relies on. Mom's public image is that of a sweet, doting, grandmotherly figure, the warm face of a beloved brand, and her private reality is that she is as ruthless, cruel, and power-hungry as anyone in the entire universe, a monopolist who despises her own customers, abuses her sons, and schemes constantly for total control. The gag is not subtle, but it does not need to be because the target is not subtle either. Mom is the whole logic of the friendly megacorporation compressed into one person, the gap between the cuddly advertising and the ruthless machine behind it. The way the biggest companies wrap their appetite in the imagery of family and care. Every time Mom drops the sweet act, the instant the cameras are off and becomes the snarling tyrant she actually is, Futurama is making a very pointed joke about who really runs things and how they would like to be seen while doing it. And it matters that so much of the technology of this world, the robots, the conveniences, comes from her, because it means the entire glittering future is, at bottom, the product of a corporation that holds its own customers in contempt. The better toys the future runs on were built by someone who hates the people using them. That is a bleak little truth to build a world on, and the series builds on it cheerfully. What I find sharp about Mom, rather than merely nasty, is that she is never quite a cartoon. Her cruelty is recognizable. You have met people who run things the way she runs hers, who beam in the advertisement and mean none of it, and Futurama is betting that you have, which is why the joke keeps its edge 1,000 years out. The political satire sits on top of all of this, most visibly in the preserved head that runs the planet, whose whole eternal presidency we already dug into. But the point of that joke extends past any one figure. The deeper satire is about permanence, about how the powerful in this world simply do not leave, cannot be gotten rid of, persist past every mechanism that was supposed to limit them. A term limit means nothing to a head in a jar. Death itself means nothing to the celebrity and political heads preserved on their shelves, still talking, still influential, 1,000 years after they should have exited the stage. The future of Futurama is a world where the old powers never die, never cede the floor, never make room, where the same faces from a millennium ago are still, somehow, in charge, still being listened to. If you wanted to make a joke about how power entrenches itself and refuses to pass on, it is hard to do better than an immortal head in a jar who cannot be term limited because he is technically no longer alive. The series got there decades ago, played it for laughs, and the laugh has only gotten more uncomfortable with time. What ties all of this together, the mutant underclass and the contemptuous corporation and the undying rulers, is a consistent and rather clear-eyed pessimism about institutions, wrapped in enough silliness that it never curdles into a rant. Futurama does not believe the future will fix us. It believes we will bring our hierarchies, our prejudices, our monopolies, and our entrenched powerful with us into the stars and simply give them robot bodies and better branding. And yet, and this is the crucial balance the show strikes, it is not a cynical show. Because against all those broken institutions, it sets the small, stubborn decency of individual people. The systems are rotten, but Leela is brave, and Fry is kind, and even Bender, underneath the theft and the bluster, will show up for his friends when it truly counts. The series' politics are bleak and its people are good, and it holds both of those at once without resolving the contradiction, which is, if you think about it, a fairly honest picture of the actual world. Bad structures, decent individuals, muddling through. Futurama just drew it 1,000 years out and gave it a laugh track it did not need. Now let's talk about the thing that actually kept all of this alive, because none of the depth we have descended through would matter if there had been no one left to find it. And the survival of Futurama is, honestly, one of the great fan stories in television history. I told you near the top that Fox let it lapse, aired it badly, and moved on, and that it came back years later as films, and then as a cable series, and then as a streaming series. What I skated past is why. Why did anyone bother reviving a canceled cartoon once, let alone 3 times, across more than 2 decades? And the answer, every time, is the audience, the people who would not let it go. Here's the mechanism because it is worth understanding. When Futurama was first dropped, it was not a hit in the way networks measure hits. It had been buried in bad time slots, aired out of order, treated as an afterthought, and its ratings reflected that mistreatment more than Futurama's quality. By the ordinary logic of television, it should have simply faded, but then it went into reruns and onto DVD and onto the late-night cable block where a certain kind of viewer, up late, up alone, discovered it and could finally watch it properly in order at their own pace. And that audience did something audiences rarely have the power to do. It grew after cancellation. Futurama became more popular dead than it had been alive, because for the first time, people could actually see it the way it was built to be seen, could catch the callbacks and the buried jokes and the long game, could sit with the sad episodes and pass them along to friends. The DVDs sold, the reruns rated, and the people who owned the property slowly realized they had made a mistake, that they were sitting on something with a devotion behind it that had not shown up in the original broadcast numbers, because the original broadcast had never given it a fair chance. That devotion is what bought the 4 films. The films are what bought the cable revival. The cable revival is what kept the world alive long enough for a streaming service to want it a decade later. Every resurrection in this show's history traces back, in the end, to viewers who refused to accept that it was over, who kept watching and kept buying and kept talking until the people with the money could not ignore them. We saw the sharpest version of that power more recently, when the fans went to war over a single voice, the campaign to keep the original actor as Bender that we walked through earlier. And it worked. The studio blinked. The voice came back. But that was only the loudest, most recent instance of a thing the fandom had been doing for 20 years, which is exert a slow, patient pressure that kept dragging the show back from the dead. There is a lovely symmetry in it that I keep turning over. This is a show whose central character is a man who was frozen, forgotten, presumed gone, and then thawed and brought back to life because it turned out he mattered more than anyone had realized. And that is almost exactly what its own fans did to the series itself, again and again. They kept it on ice through the lean years and thawed it out whenever the culture was ready to want it again. The audience became the nibbler of the real world, the small devoted force working behind the scenes to make sure the thing they loved would survive to matter when the time came. I do not think the writers planned that parallel, but given how much this show loves a payoff planted years early, I like to imagine they appreciated it, and the pieces of the series that broke off and drifted into the wider culture kept the flame lit in the meantime, kept new people arriving. We already talked about how fragments of Futurama escaped into the internet, the cheerful cry of good news detached from Futurama and used everywhere to introduce something terrible. The reaction image about being so eager to buy something that the details stop mattering, the chant of praise to a hypnotizing toad, the very phrase and imagery of a man frozen and thawed. These fragments did quiet recruiting work for years. Someone would use one of these jokes online, not even knowing where it came from, and somebody else would recognize it, and a new viewer would go looking for the source and find the whole iceberg waiting under the meme. The series propagated itself through its own broken-off pieces, seeded 1,000 small entry points across the culture, so that it was never really possible to forget it entirely, because bits of it were everywhere, load-bearing in the language of the internet, pointing back home. A show that scatters that thoroughly into the common culture is very hard to kill, because you would have to reach into millions of separate conversations and memories to fully remove it, and by now that is simply not possible. Futurama has become, in a small way, part of the furniture of how a whole generation talks. I think it is worth being honest at this late depth about what it means that the show keeps coming back, because it is not a simple triumph. Every time a beloved thing returns after it was supposed to be over, there is a risk, and fans feel it. The worry that the new version will not measure up, that a perfect ending will be undone, that the magic that came from a specific group of people at a specific moment cannot simply be summoned again on demand. Futurama has had to carry that weight with each revival, the weight of not just continuing but justifying its continuation. proving that it still has something to say rather than merely cashing in on affection. And the honest truth is that a show that has ended sincerely 3 or 4 times, that has written that many real goodbyes, is in a strange position because each new season has to reopen a door the previous ending closed with such care. I do not think there is a clean answer to whether it should keep going forever, whether at some point the kindest thing would be to let one of those beautiful endings actually be the end. But I also understand completely why it does not stop, why the people who make it and the people who watch it keep saying yes to one more, because we have already seen at the very bottom of this show's own logic that its answer to the question of going around again was yes. Of course it keeps coming back. It is a show that, in its own finale, looked at the prospect of doing the whole imperfect thing over again and chose to. It would be strange, almost a betrayal of its own deepest belief, for it to do anything else. Before we rise back to the surface, I want to spend a little time at a level we have mostly passed over on our way to the deeper stuff, which is the enormous supporting cast, the deep bench of recurring aliens and robots and oddballs who make this galaxy feel populated rather than like a stage with 7 regulars on it. Because one of the underappreciated feats of Futurama is how many memorable characters it keeps in rotation and how few actors, as we discussed, are actually doing all of them. This is where a lot of the series' density and rewatchability lives, in the sense that the world keeps going when the main crew is off screen, that there is a whole civilization out there with its own celebrities and monsters and politicians. Consider the news. In this future, the news is delivered by a pairing that is a perfect little joke about broadcast media, a cheerful human anchorwoman and her co-anchor, who is a large, scowling green alien named Morbo, a creature who openly hates humanity, who barely contains his contempt for the very species he is reading the news to, and who periodically lets slip references to the coming alien invasion he is clearly part of, all while maintaining the bland, professional cadence of a local news broadcast. The joke is that his monstrousness is completely accepted, that his human co-host chirps along beside him unbothered as he seethes with genocidal disdain, because that is simply the format, and the format smooths over anything. It is a sharp little bit about how the packaging of television news can normalize absolutely anything, delivered through a furious green alien who wants everyone watching him dead and reads the weather anyway. Morbo is one of my favorite small things in the whole run, precisely because the joke never escalates. He does not take over, he never gets an arc, he simply simmers there night after night, reading the traffic to a species he openly despises. And the flat professionalism of it lands harder for me than any amount of shouting ever could. Or consider Leela, the ruler of a planet called Omicron Persei 8, a blustering, dome-headed alien conqueror who periodically threatens Earth with invasion over increasingly petty grievances, often connected to Earth's television, which his planet receives on a 1,000-year delay, so that he launches military campaigns over the cancellation of shows he has only just finished watching a millennium late. There is a wonderful running joke buried in that premise, an alien warlord whose relationship to Earth is essentially that of a furious, entitled fan of its broadcasts, ready to destroy the whole planet because a program he was enjoying did not resolve the way he wanted. Given everything we have said about this show's own relationship with cancellation and with its passionate audience, there is something almost self-aware about an alien who would burn a world down over a canceled show. And the series mines it for great comedy every time he descends. Or consider Calculon, the impossibly vain robot actor who is the star of the future's most popular soap opera, a melodramatic in-universe show about the tangled lives of robots, all overacting and gasping revelations, which the characters on Futurama watch religiously. Calculon is a satire of a certain kind of self-serious performer, a machine so consumed by his own dramatic importance that every line he delivers is pitched at the back of a theater no matter how small the moment. And in keeping with the series' love of pushing a joke to its absurd conclusion, Calculon's career and existence have gone through the kind of grand operatic deaths and improbable resurrections that his own soap opera would feature, the character dying with maximum melodrama and returning when it has further use for him, which is its own quiet joke about how nobody in show business ever really stays gone if there is still an audience. That last idea, of course, is one this series knows intimately from the inside. Around these three, you can stack dozens more, a whole gallery, the smooth-voiced hedonist robot who exists purely to indulge in luxury, the robot mafia with their pincer-handed enforcer, the strange and menacing figures who populate the corners of episodes, the preserved celebrity heads we have already discussed lining the shelves of their museum, ready to be pulled into a story. And nearly all of them, the newscaster who hates you, the warlord who invades over television, the melodramatic actor, the luxury robot, the mob enforcer, come from the throats of the same tiny group of performers, one actor in particular carrying an astonishing share of these supporting monsters alongside his lead roles, layering voice on voice until the world sounds enormous. When I said at the very start that the surface of this show is a small cast flying packages around a cartoon galaxy, this is the part I was underselling because the galaxy around that small cast is stuffed, corner to corner, with fully realized weirdos, each one specific, each one good for a laugh a decade after you first met them. A world only feels real when it feels inhabited, when you get the sense that the story you are following is just one thread in a much larger and busier place. And Futurama earns that feeling through the sheer density of its supporting population, most of it conjured by a handful of voices working overtime. And that fourth film I have mentioned a couple of times, the one released in early 2009, deserves a note here at the bottom because it was written and built specifically as a farewell, a deliberate attempt to send the whole thing off with grace before anyone knew that cable would resurrect it for years more. It was meant to be the last word, the intended ending after Fox, a real goodbye to this whole populated galaxy. And then of course it was not, because the show came back, as it always does. But I find something moving in the fact that it exists, in the fact that the people making this show, having already been canceled once, sat down and poured themselves into what they believed was a final send-off, gave the world and its enormous cast a proper farewell, and meant it, and then were lucky enough to have to unmean it. That is the pattern of the whole thing in miniature, one more time. A sincere ending, offered in good faith, and then a return nobody was promised. This show has said a real goodbye more times than almost any show in history, and each time it said it like it counted, which is exactly why the goodbyes land, and exactly why. When it walks back in the door, we are so glad to see it. We have climbed all the way down the ice now, from the shadow under the desk in the first minute to the theorem on the whiteboard and the universe that ends and begins again. And as we start to rise back toward the surface, I want to leave you with the one idea that holds this entire strange structure together, because once you have it, you can never watch the series the same way again. And I mean that as the best possible gift. The idea is this: in Futurama, the throwaway detail is never a throwaway. The thing in the background is the thing that matters. The joke you laughed at and forgot is the setup for a payoff that will not arrive for years. This show is built, top to bottom, on the principle that what looks like decoration is actually structure, that the small stuff is load-bearing, and once you understand that, the whole series turns into a kind of treasure map where the treasure is patience. We have seen it at every depth we visited, a shape under a desk that turns out to be the hinge of a universe-saving plot. A serial number that turns out to carry 100-year-old piece of mathematical folklore, a string of ones and zeros in a mirror that turns out to be the number of the devil. A funny paradox about a man and his grandmother that turns out to be the reason he can save all of existence. A caption under a logo, a symbol on a sign, a bit of alien graffiti that turns out to be readable and to be a joke, addressed to whoever cared enough to decode it. Over and over, this show takes the parts of the frame you are trained to ignore and fills them with meaning, so that the reward for attention is not just an extra laugh, but the slow, dawning realization that someone thought about every inch of this, that nothing here is lazy, that the whole thing was made by people who assumed you were smart and patient and willing to look twice. That assumption, that respect for the audience, is rarer than any theorem, and it is the real reason this show has a bottom half worth descending into at all. And the part that matters for you tonight is this one. You do not have to catch any of it. That is the genius of the design we keep circling back to. The series works completely as a funny cartoon about a delivery boy and his robot friend, and you can watch it your whole life at that level and be perfectly satisfied. The depth is optional. It is a gift left for the curious, not a toll charged at the door. So if you go back to Futurama after tonight, You do not need to freeze every frame and factor every number and decode every sign. You can just watch it and love it and let the depth be there whether or not you go looking for it. The way the sea is there under a boat whether or not you ever dive. But you will know now that it is down there. You will know that the shadow means something, that the sign says something, that the sad episode is doing something more careful than it lets on. And that knowledge changes the texture of the whole thing, gives even the silliest episode a kind of weight because you understand that the people who made it were never only kidding. They were building something enormous and patient and secretly sincere under a comedy for anyone who ever wanted to look. And whether you dive for it or just float above it, it is one of the richest things anyone has ever hidden inside a cartoon. There is one last piece of the machinery I want to name before we surface because it is the technique that makes everything else possible. The specific trick this show pulls better than almost anyone, and it is worth understanding as a craft rather than just feeling it as an ambush. It is the way Futurama uses comedy as an anesthetic. Think about how the saddest episodes are actually constructed. They do not announce themselves. They do not open on mournful music and tell you to prepare to feel something. They open as ordinary episodes, often as some of the funniest episodes, full of jokes and nonsense and the usual chaos. And they keep you laughing, keep you relaxed, keep your guard all the way down, right up until the moment they slip the knife in. The dog episode is a comedy about cloning and a robot's jealousy, funny for most of its length, until the final minutes when it turns and destroys you. The brother episode is a caper about tracking down stolen property, played light, until the last shot at the grave. Futurama gets you laughing precisely so that you are not braced for the grief, and then it delivers the grief at full strength into a body that has completely forgotten to protect itself. That is not an accident, and it is not cruelty, though it can feel like it. It is a genuine understanding of how emotion works, which is that we defend ourselves against sadness when we see it coming, we steel up, we hold it at arm's length, and a story that telegraphs its tragedy gives us time to build that wall. Comedy takes the wall down. When you are laughing, you are open, unguarded, trusting the series to keep things light. And it is in exactly that open state that a real feeling can get all the way in before you can stop it. Futurama learned to use its own comedy as the way past your defenses, to make you laugh your way into a vulnerability you would never have allowed if the show had been honest about where it was taking you. And the result is that its sad moments do not just make you sad, they wound, because they land somewhere Futurama tricked you into leaving undefended. Very few comedies are brave enough or cruel enough or loving enough to do that to their audience on purpose. This one built its whole identity on it, the laugh and the wound as a single motion, and it is the reason people who have not seen the series in years can still be undone by the mere mention of a certain dog or a certain grave, or a certain frozen lifetime lived in a single stopped second. The jokes fade from memory. The wounds do not. That is the trade it makes with you, and it is, I think, a fair and generous one, because a feeling that costs you something is a feeling you get to keep. I mentioned the 4 films several times on the way down, and I want to give them one proper moment before we surface, because they are the overlooked stratum of the entire iceberg, a whole era of the series that a surprising number of fans have never actually watched, and they are worth knowing about even if you never seek them out. When Futurama came back the first time, it did not come back as television. It came back as 4 feature-length stories, released across the late 2000s, each one a full movie rather than a half-hour episode, which gave the writers room to attempt bigger, denser, more sprawling stories than the series format normally allowed. The first of them is the time travel-soaked one we keep circling, the one built around a stolen ability to move through time and a species of scheming aliens, the one that reaches back and rewrites the fate of a certain dog and introduces the whole grim logic of doomed duplicates that we explored in the coldest water. The second is a strange, ambitious story involving an enormous entity reaching into our universe from another dimension, a swing at cosmic, tentacled horror filtered through the show's sensibility. The third is an extended parody of fantasy and role-playing games, the crew tumbling into a Dungeons & Dragons-style adventure, a chance for the series to leave science fiction entirely and play in a different genre for 90 minutes. And the fourth, as we said, was built as a genuine farewell, a deliberate send-off for the whole world before cable brought it back. What is interesting about these films, sitting here with the whole shape of Futurama in mind, is that they are where a lot of the deepest lore actually got formalized. The rules we spent so long on, the mechanics of backward time travel, the doomed duplicates, the fuller cosmology of the universe, a good deal of that load-bearing canon was worked out or deepened in the films rather than in the episodes, because the longer running time gave the writers space to actually build machinery rather than just gesture at it. And then, when the films were recut into episodes for cable, that machinery got folded back into the ordinary flow of the series, so that fans watching the broadcast version absorbed the deep lore without necessarily realizing it had originated in a direct-to-disc movie. It is a slightly hidden layer even within Futurama's own history, a body of work that is simultaneously central to the canon and peripheral to how most people experienced it. 4 movies doing crucial structural work in a corner of the franchise that a casual fan might not even know exists. If you ever want to go deeper than the episodes, that is where the next room down actually is, and it is a strange and uneven and ambitious set of stories made by a team that had just been given a second life and was clearly determined to use every minute of it, not knowing how many minutes they would get. And that brings us finally back up toward the surface and up toward the present, because the remarkable thing to sit with as we rise is that this is not a story with a closed ending we are looking back on from a safe distance. As of now, Futurama is still going. It came back yet again on its streaming home, has been releasing new batches of episodes into the middle of this decade, one of them arriving all at once rather than week by week, with more reported to be on the way. The series that Fox let lapse more than 20 years ago that everyone kept assuming was finished is still, right now, producing new stories about the same crew, with very nearly all of the same voices, an unbroken thread of continuity somehow surviving across 3 networks, 4 cancellations, and more than a quarter of a century. There are television dramas that could not hold their cast together for 5 straight years. This cartoon has held most of its together, on and off since the last century, across every attempt the industry made to end it. Whatever else you want to say about Futurama, that longevity is close to unheard of, and it happened not through corporate planning but through sheer stubborn survival, the show and its audience refusing together to accept that any of the endings were final. So let that be where we come to rest, back at the surface now, the water calm above everything we just descended through. Futurama is a show that arrived looking like a goofy cartoon about a frozen pizza boy and a robot who drinks, and turned out to be one of the most carefully engineered, deeply felt, secretly brilliant things that American television has ever produced. It hid real mathematics in a robot's serial number and real grief in a dog's last afternoon. It built a decade-long plot on a shadow it planted in its first 30 seconds, and it built a love story so patient that it took 15 years and 4 cancellations to let 2 people finally choose each other. It made the smartest people in the room write jokes for the back row and the deepest jokes for the front, and it trusted always that someone was paying enough attention to find what it left down there. It gave a preserved head a planet to run, and a broke lobster a tragedy to carry, and a criminal robot a soul he would never admit to having, and it did all of it while making you laugh so hard you forgot to notice how much you were being told about time and loss and the strange, stubborn business of staying alive after everything you loved is gone. It looked at its own repeated death and decided every single time to come back. And in doing so, it became a kind of proof of its own gentlest idea, that things do not have to stay ended, that the frozen can be thawed, that what mattered once can matter again if someone still cares enough to bring it back. That is a rare thing for a comedy to be about, and a rarer thing for a comedy to actually be, and I do not think we will see many others like it. Thank you for coming all the way down the ice with me tonight. If your eyes are already heavy, that is exactly as it should be, and you can let this be the last thing you hear before you drift off. The world above will keep spinning, the series will keep coming back, and none of it needs you to stay awake for it. Rest now. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.